Hello, I'm Rachel. This is my book club. Welcome to the book club. It is vampire themed, it is currently untitled, and once you're in it, you can never leave. Why does that make me laugh every time? Today, I want to read with you Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Brite. Lost Souls is a southern gothic horror vampire novel. So, content warnings will be in the description. Decide if you can read this or not with me. Another content warning is that I tone down a lot of the swearing, so you'll hear a lot of gosh darns. If that triggers you, I understand. Here is a synopsis on the screen. Pause to read. One more thing before we get started. I wanted to just clear up any possible misconceptions about my choices of editing certain characters and their point of views. Specifically, the human characters, Steve, Ghost, and Anne. I'm a little concerned that it may seem like I cut out a lot of the humans because they were annoying. But it's really more because the novel's just kind of like a not quite an anthology, but kind of. So everybody's always like doing things and things are happening, but they're not necessarily vampire related. And the humans don't really meet the vampires until like midway through. So it's just like a lot of like little random like horror, which works if for a horror novel and a video about horror, but this is about vampires. So, to save time and frustration, they're largely gone. Okay? That's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much for even getting this far at all. Consider subscribing and let's get into it. Prologue. In the spring, families in the suburbs of New Orleans hang wreaths on their front doors. Gay straw wreaths of gold and purple and green, wreaths with bells and froths of ribbons trailing down, blowing, tangling in the warm wind. The children have king cake parties. Each slice of cake is iced with a different sweet, sticky topping. Candied cherries and colored sugar are favorites. And the child who finds a pink plastic baby in his slice will enjoy a year of good luck. The baby represents the infant Christ, and children seldom choke on it. Jesus loves little children. The adults buy spangled cat's eye masks for masquerades, and other women's husbands pull other men's wives to them under cover of Spanish moss and anonymity. I have no idea how hard that was for me to say. Hot silk and desperate searching tongues, and the wet ground, and the ghostly white scent of magnolias opening in the night, and the colored paper lanterns on the veranda in the distance. You weren't scheduled to appear for at least 20 more minutes. Okay. Christian's bar was way down Rue de Chartres, away from the middle of the quarter toward Canal Street. It was only 9:30. No one ever came in until 10, not even on Mardi Gras nights. No one except the girl in the black silk dress, the thin little girl with the short, soft, dark hair that fell in a curtain across her eyes. Christian always wanted to brush it away from her face, to feel it trickle through his fingers like rain. Tonight, as usual, she slipped in at 9:30 and looked around for the friends who were never there. When the girl saw Christian standing alone behind the bar, narrow, white, and immaculate with his black hair glittering on his shoulders, she came and hopped onto a bar stool. She had to boost herself, and said, as she did most nights, "Can I have a screwdriver?" "Just how old are you, love?" Christian asked, as he did most nights. 20. She was lying by at least 4 years, but her voice was so soft that he had to listen with his whole cupped ear to hear it, and her arms on the bar were thin and downed with fine blonde hairs. The big smudges of dark makeup like bruises around her eyes, the ratty bangs, and the little sandaled feet with their toenails painted orange only made her more childlike. He mixed the drink weak and put 2 cherries in it. She fished the cherries out with her fingers and ate them one by one, sucking them like candy before she started sipping her drink. Christian knew the girl came to his bar because the drinks were cheap and he would serve them to her with no annoying questions about ID or why a pretty girl wanted to drink alone. She always turned with a start every time the street door opened, and her hand would fly to her throat. "Who are you waiting for?" Christian asked her the first time she came in. "The vampires," she told him. She said her name was Jessie, and Christian only smiled at her joke about the vampires. He didn't know how much she knew, but she had pretty ways and a sweet, shy smile, and she was a tiny brightness in every ashen, empty night. He certainly wasn't going to bite her. The vampires got into town sometime before midnight. They parked their black van in an illegal space, then got hold of a bottle of chartreuse and reeled down Bourbon Street, swigging it by turns, their arms around one another's shoulders, their hair in one another's faces. All three had outlined their features in dark blots of makeup, and the larger two had teased their hair into great tangled clumps. Their pockets were stuffed with candy they ate noisily, washing it down with sweet green mouthfuls of chartreuse. Their names were Molokai, Twig, and Zilla, and they wished they had fangs, but had to make do with teeth they filed sharp, and they could walk in sunlight as their great-grandfathers could not. But they preferred to do their roaming at night, and as they roamed unsteadily down Bourbon Street, they raised their glasses in song. Zilla was the most beautiful of the three, with a smooth, symmetrical, androgynous face, with brilliant eyes as green as the last drop of chartreuse in the bottle. Only Zilla's hands gave away his gender. They were large and strong and heavily veined beneath the thin white skin. He wore his nails long and pointed, and he wore his caramel-colored hair tied back with a purple silk scarf. Wisps of the ponytail had escaped, framing the stunning face, the achingly green eyes. Zilla stood a head and a half shorter than Molokai and Twig, but his ice-cold poise and the way his larger companions flanked him told onlookers that Zilla was the absolute leader here. Molokai was baby-faced, with large round eyes and a wide wet mouth he liked to smear with orange lipstick. Twig's face was angular and clever. His eyes tracked every movement, but the two were of the same size and shape, and more often than not they walked or staggered in step with each other. They left the sleazy lights of Bourbon Street behind, swayed left onto dark Conti and right onto Chartres. I already forget how to say it. Soon enough they found a tiny bar with stained glass windows and a friendly light inside. The sign above the door said Christians. The vampires staggered in. They were the only customers except for a silent little girl sitting at the bar, so they commandeered a table and slammed down another bottle of chartreuse, talking loudly to each other, then looking at Christian and laughing, shrugging. His forehead was very high and pale, and his nails were as long and pointed as Zilla's. "Maybe," said Molokai, and Twig said, "Ask him." They both looked at Zilla for approval. Zilla glanced over at Christian and raised a languid eyebrow, then lifted one shoulder in a tiny shrug. No one paid any attention to the girl at the bar, although she stared at them ceaselessly, her eyes bright, her lips moist and slightly parted. Gross. When Christian brought them their tab, Molokai dug deep in his pocket and produced a coin. He did not put the coin in Christian's hand, but held it up to the light so that Christian might look well at it. It was a silver doubloon, the same shape and size of those thrown from Mardi Gras parade floats, along with the treasure trove of other trinkets, beads, the bright toys, the sweet sugar candy. How do you come?" Christian stammered. Molokai smiled his chocolatey smile. "In peace," he said. He looked at Zilla, who nodded. Molokai did not take his eyes from Zilla's as he picked up the empty green and gold chartreuse bottle, broke it against the edge of the table, and drew a razor edge of glass across the soft skin of his right wrist. A shallow crimson gash opened there, nearly obscene in its brightness. Molokai, still smiling, offered his wrist to Christian. Christian pressed his lips to the gash, closed his eyes, and sucked like a baby, tasting the Garden of Eden in the drops of chartreuse that mingled with Molokai's blood. Twig watched for a few moments, his eyes dark, his face lost, almost bewildered. Then he picked up Molokai's left arm and bit at the skin of the wrist until the blood flowed there, too. Jessie watched with eyes wide and disbelieving. Jessie stood up very quietly, and then the bloodlust she had wanted so badly was upon her. She leapt, tore Molokai's arm away from Twig, and tried to fasten her lips on the gash. But Molokai turned furiously on her and batted her away, hard across the face, and she felt the pain in her lip before she tasted the blood there, her own dull blood in her mouth. Molokai and Twig, even kind Christian, stood staring at her, bloodied and wild-eyed, like dogs startled by a kill, like interrupted lovers. But as she backed away from them, a pair of warm arms went around her from behind, and a voice whispered, "His blood is sticky sweet anyway, my dear. I can give you something nicer." She never knew Zilla's name or how she ended up with him on a blanket in the back room of Christian's bar. Gross. It was one of the rare nights that Malachi, Twig, and Zilla spent apart. Zilla slept on the blanket with Jesse, hidden between cases of whiskey. Malachi slept in Christian's room above the bar with Christian and Twig cuddled close to him, their mouths still working sleepily at his wrists. Below, far away on Bourbon Street, the mounted police rode their high-stepping steeds through the crowd, chanting, "Leave the street. Mardi Gras is officially over. Leave the street. Mardi Gras is officially over." Each one ready with a sap for a drunken skull. And the sun came up on the Wednesday morning trash in the gutters, the butts and the cans and the gaudy forgotten beads, and the vampires slept with their lovers, for they preferred to do the roaming at night. Malachi, Twig, and Zilla left town the next evening after the sun went down, so they never knew that Jessie was pregnant. Jessie disappeared for nearly a month. When she came back to Christian's bar, it was to stay for good. Christian gave her the richest food he could afford and let her wash glasses when she insisted on earning her keep. I wonder how I'm going to censor this. Oh, God. When her time came, Christian poured whiskey down her throat like water. It wasn't enough. Jessie screamed until she could scream no more, and her eyes showed only the whites with their silvery rims, and great gouts of blood poured from her. When the baby slipped out of Jessie, its head turned and its eyes met Christian's, confused, intelligent, innocent. A shred of deep pink tissue was caught in the tiny mouth, softening between the working gums. Christian separated the baby from Jessie, wrapped it in a blanket, and held it up to the window. If its first sight was of the French Quarter, it would know its way around those streets forever, should it ever need such knowledge. Then he knelt between Jessie's limp legs and looked at the torn passage that had given him so many nights of idle pleasure. Ruined now. Bloody. So much blood to go to waste. Christian licked his lips, licked them again. Gross. Little Nothing was a lovely baby, a sugar candy confection of a baby with enormous dark blue eyes and a mass of golden brown hair. Someone would love him, someone human, away from the south, away from the hot night air and the legends. Nothing might escape the hunger for blood, might be happy, might be whole. Toward dawn, in a Maryland suburb full of fine, graceful houses, dark, grassy lawns, long, sleek cars, and sweeping driveways, a tall, thin figure draped in heavy black clothes stooped, set a bundle down on a doorstep, and went slowly away without looking back. Christian was remembering the last night of Mardi Gras, and the taste of blood and altars was in his mouth. The baby Nothing opened his eyes and saw darkness, soft and velvety, pricked with sparkling white light. His mouth drew down. His eyebrows came together in a frown. He was hungry. He could not see the basket that cradled him, could not read the note in spidery handwriting pinned to his blanket. His name was Nothing. Care for him, and he will bring you luck. He lay in the basket snug as a king cake baby, pink and tiny as the infant Christ in plastic, and he knew only that he wanted light and warmth and food, as a baby will. And he opened his mouth wide and showed his soft pink gums and yelled. He yelled long and loud until the door opened and warm hands took him in. Part 1, 15 years later. The night wind felt wonderful in Steve's hair. The Thunderbird was huge. It always drove like an effing monster, but tonight Steve felt as if he were piloting some great steamboat down a magic river, a river of shimmering asphalt banked by pine forests and thick, rioting expanses of kudzu. They were somewhere far outside Missing Mile, somewhere on the highway that led up to the Roxborough Electric Power Plant, and beyond that, the North Carolina-Virginia border. Ghost was asleep beside him, his head hung out the window on the passenger side, his pale hair whipping in the night, his face washed in moonlight. The bottle of whiskey was propped between Ghost's legs, 3/4 empty, in danger of tipping despite the limp hand that curled around it. Steve leaned over and grabbed the bottle, took a healthy swig. "The T-Bird has been drinking," he sang into the wind. "Yes, the T-Bird has been drinking, not me." Said Ghost. What? Forget it," Steve told him. "Go back to sleep. Have another drink." He drove faster. He'd wake Ghost on the drive home to keep him company. Now he wanted Ghost to stay asleep a while longer. There was bad business ahead. Dangerous business. Or so Steve liked to think of it. He and the whiskey sang Ghost to sleep, the whiskey with its somnolent amber song, Steve with a voice that cracked when he tried to hit the high notes. Behind them, the river passed in silence. The lowest hanging branches brushed the water, and the leaves rotted on the bow. The moon spread like butter on the black river, and Ghost's eyes closed. With his head pillowed on the hump between the seats, he began to dream. Ghost often dreamed of things that were going to happen, or of things that had already happened that he couldn't possibly know about. These premonitions could come when he was awake too, but the ones that came to him in dreams seemed to be the most potent. More often than not, they were also the most cryptic. He had known when his grandmother was going to die, but then so had she. Though surely painful, the knowledge had given them the time they needed to say goodbye. Suddenly unnerved by the prospect of touching Ghost's dreams, Steve put his hand back on the wheel. They had other friends, sure, but those guys mostly wanted to go out drinking and smoke weed and talk about Wolfpack football at the State University over in Raleigh. All of which was okay, even though the Wolfpack was pretty crappy, but Ghost was different. Ghost didn't give a flying F about football. Ghost could drink everybody else under the table and not get a darn bit weirder. And Ghost understood all the crap that had gone down over the past few months. The crap with Anne. Ghost never asked Steve why he didn't forget about Anne and get himself a new girlfriend. Ghost understood why Steve didn't want to see Anne or any other girl. Not for months and months. Maybe not ever. Not until he could trust himself anyway. Right now, he did not deserve the company of women. However lonely or horny he got, he had it coming to him for what he had done to Anne. He played with strands of Ghost's hair as he drove, winding them around his fingers, marveling at their fineness, their silvery gold luster. His hair was dirty, and he noticed that Ghost's was too. Steve hadn't been taking care of himself. He'd gone days without a shower and over a month without washing his clothes. He'd been late for his job at the record store 3 times last week. He was putting away a 12-pack of bud every day or two. But he hoped it wasn't rubbing off on Ghost. There was such a thing as being too darn sympathetic. Steve's hand felt greasy. He wiped it on his t-shirt. They were here. Steve had no idea where, but he saw what he wanted. The faded light of an ancient Pepsi machine sitting outside a fishing and hunting store, casting dim red and blue shadows in the dirt of the parking lot. Steve swung the T-bird in and killed the ignition. Steve fished in the back seat. Cassette cases. So that was where Anne's darn Cocteau Twins tape had ended up. Steve had always hated it anyway, the girl's feathery voice that was supposed to be so angelic, and the ethereal, seasick wall of sound, empty food bags, and a veritable sea of beer cans. Finally, he dug out his special tool, a length of coat hanger bent into a hook at one end. With a last glance at Ghost, Steve knelt, fed the wire into the coin return slot of the machine, and wiggled it around until he felt it catch. He tugged gently, and seconds later was blessed by a shower of silver. Steve scooped the quarters, dimes, and nickels out of the dirt, shoved them into his pockets, hustled back to the car, and got out of the parking lot. 20 fast miles later, Steve had the radio on a rock station, and Ghost was trying to decide whether to rejoin the living. Are we still in North Carolina? Yeah, Steve turned Led Zeppelin down and waited for the stories. Ghost always told Steve his dreams, and they were sometimes coherent, sometimes nonsensical and lovely, and almost invariably a little frightening. When they were young, they were the world's darlings. The world's opinion meant everything to them, even though they tried to pretend it meant nothing. Their town was even grayer and muddier when they pranced along the streets after midnight, and the rooftops bent to kiss their dyed hair. They wandered through the shops, putting their delicate fingerprints on the window glass and china, touching anything colorful or sweet, pinching things between thumb and forefinger as if to grasp the town in both hands would dirty them, sully them. Ghost rolled sully over his tongue as if it were scuppernong wine. In his thick Carolina voice, the word took on a dark, rich flavor. Sully them. The big boys at their school shouted things at them, black, dirty things that stink of toilet wall scrawls and smeared basins. But those boys never fought them because they knew the twins were magic. Everyone knew the twins would go away to the city someday, where they could pick rhinestones out of the cigarette sludge in the gutter, and the moon would be as aching and vivid as neon cheese and blue velvet sky. And they did. They went to New Orleans. Artists put them in films. They were twins, and the hip crowd loved the perversity of that. Their mirror image pornography was art, and they were allowed every art and luxury and perversion the city held because of their over-rouged lips and their sluts' eyes and the poetry of their hands. Sluts' eyes. They grew jaded, tired, but still insatiable on their own mattress. They lived and saw the first lines appear around their eyes. They saw years of liquor, expensive cigarettes, drugs, and passion etch themselves on their movie starlit faces. They bit at each other's throats in desperation, thinking to regain beauty and blood, to drink the pulse of life. But their blood was thin, grainy, mixed with other substances, no longer the rich purple fountain they had once known. They went out less, spending whole days flat on the mattress like two dry sticks side by side, forgetting to eat, watching the cobweb cracks in the ceiling plaster widen, spread like the tracery on their faces. The high, stupid scream of a siren split the night open. Ghost's voice trailed off. Blue light pulsated in the rear view mirror. Turned Ghost's face pallid, made the litter of beer cans seem to whirl and dance. Steve wrenched the wheel to the right, braked hard, and they skidded on the surface of the dark road and stopped. Gravel sprang from the tires, a thin trail of black rubber behind them. But they were whole and safe, and so was the car, and most blessedly of all, the police car was passing them, sirens still screaming, lights still whirling like a cold blue dervish. Up ahead was a riot of lights and movement. Red lights, blue lights, someone standing in the road flagging the T-Bird down. Steve stopped, and the flagman motioned him forward. Slow, he signaled. An ambulance. 2 police cars. An officer talking to a tired country woman in a torn bathrobe and curlers. There was something else in the yard, near the roadside, something that had excited the dog, something the children were trying to see, something naked, dry, withered, a child. But what could have shriveled it so, leached its life away? Flecks of gravel were embedded in the soft skin of his face, his head lolled back, half severed, the dark red cavern of his throat glistening. But there was so little blood, and the raw tissues within looked wasted, parched. As Steve rolled down his window and handed his driver's license to one of the cops, Ghost turned his head and stared back at the blanket, at the body beneath it. His eyes lost their focus. Then, slowly, they closed. Ghost saw through the blanket, through death. He saw how the boy had looked alive, curiosity and intelligence in his young eyes. The name came to him as clearly as a memory, Robert. Ghost felt Robert's terror mount as he caught sounds, insidious whispers, soft laughter, sounds not of the night and its usual spooks, but something darker, stranger, more purposeful, and far, far deadlier. And then the hands, grabbing him from behind, 4 strong and sharp-fingered hands, and the hungry mouths all over him, sucking out his strength and his life. At the end, there was only pain that spiraled up and stretched itself impossibly thin. Exquisite pain, pain that precluded all thought, all memory, all identity. Ghost lay quiet, and he knew the insensate loneliness of a corpse on the roadside, growing cold, the taste of blood melting from the tongue, the eyes filming over, the impossibility of human contact ever again, of comfort ever again. Let it go, Ghost, Steve said. You can't take on all the pain in the world. Let it go, man. Ghost shuddered, then began to slip back. Warmth. Blood where it ought to be, in his veins, flowing safely and sanely. The ambulance, the police cars, the lonely, dry, dead thing under the blanket were far away now, left behind. What happened to those twins? Steve asked as they drove on. In your dream. They grew weak, he said. Eventually, they had to spend alternate days alive. One would watch over the other, keeping vigil over the still chest, the blotted out eyes, the drying mouth. At the first tinge of dawn, the dead twin would begin to move, and the living twin would lie down and stretch himself taut on the mattress, his skin already crackling on his bones, his hair straggling like grass across his bare, hollow shoulders. One day their eyes were open, but neither of them moved. Ghost finished in a rush of breath, whiskey and fear, breath, upset all over again. Steve kept hold of Ghost's hand. Ghost's fingers twitched. Jesus, Ghost, Steve said. Jesus, Ghost. Chapter 2. The last dying days of summer, fall coming on fast. A cold night, the first of the season, a change from the usual bland Maryland climate. Cold, thought the boy. His mind felt numb. On his razor-scarred, wax-scabbed desk before him lay a picture postcard. The design on its front was multicolored and abstract. There were splotches of deep lipstick pink, streaks of sea green and storm gray, flecks of gold embossed in thin, bright leaves. He picked up his fountain pen with the graceful heart-shaped nib, dipped its delicate tip into his bottle of ink, pen and ink having been stolen from the art room at school, and wrote a few spidery lines on the message side of the postcard. Then the boy stretched his legs under the desk and with the bare toes of both feet grasped the bottle he had hidden there. Then he picked up the postcard, brought it to his mouth, gave it a whiskey tongue kiss, kissed it as hungrily as he had ever dreamed of kissing the sweetest witch's mouth. Then he picked up the pen again and signed his name. Nothing. He signed his name again, nothing, in blood, tracing over the black letters with scarlet. The ink ran into the blood, and the whole thing dried rusty, brown-black, the color of an old scab. The results did not altogether disappoint him. Nothing turned off the light and watched the reflection of his bedroom click out of existence, watched the cold night fill the panes. He lay on his bed and watched the stars and planets glowing on his ceiling behind the layers of black fishnet he had hung up. He'd painted them there, the rings of Saturn lopsided, the constellations crazed. He felt his room gather itself in the dark and stand darkly around him, not frightening but surely full of power. He was never certain what was here. Cigarettes, he thought, flowers from the graveyard, and that bone, that darned bone. His friend Sue wouldn't say where it came from. Books, most of them stolen from thrift shop shelves where he left only his finger marks in the dust. Horror stories, thin books of poems. Dylan Thomas, of course, and others. All the objects here, all the pencil drawings on the walls and pictures cut out of obscure music magazines and secret lists and notebooks, wove a web of power around him. "Jason, are you asleep? It's only 9. Too much sleep is bad for you." His parents stepped into the room, and he felt the web of power collapse and drift down, broken strands brushing his face. Mother, fresh from her crystal healing class at the Arts Center, looked exalted. Her eyes sparkled. There was too much blush on her cheeks. Father, behind her, only looked glad to be home. "Did you do your homework?" Mother asked. "I don't want you going to sleep this early if you haven't done your homework. You know what your father and I thought of a smart boy like you getting those grades last quarter. A C in algebra." "My support circle meditated with our rose crystals tonight," Mother said. "I thought of you. I don't want to keep you from fulfilling yourself. I certainly don't want to decrease your potential." She paused to glance at Father glowering in the background, then let the great revelation fly. "You can get your ear pierced after all if you still want to. Your father or I will go with you." "I don't want to decrease your potential. You can get your ears pierced." Wait a minute. Wait 1 minute. Just what the heck is this? Father crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled the bottle of Johnny Walker from under the desk. "Just a minute, Roger." Mother radiated benevolence, spiritual wholeness. "Jason is not a bad child. If he's drinking, we should spend more quality time." Quality time, my butt. Nothing decided. He liked Father better than Mother these days. Not that he liked either of them much. Jason is not a child at all. He is 15 and runs with a gang of punkers who gave him a liquor habit and God knows what else. Now he's stealing from us. Things are going to change. "Roger, we'll talk about it among ourselves. Don't worry, Jason. You're not in trouble." Mother positively floated from the room, pulling Father after her. Father slammed the door. A stack of books fell over, spilling Plath and Bradbury and William Burroughs across the floor in an unlikely orgy of paper and dust. "I've got to get out of this place," he thought, just before dawn, and the ghosts of all the decades of middle-class American children afraid of complacency and stagnation and comfortable death drifted before his face, whispering their agreement. Oh my god. He's so funny. In Nothing's English class the next day, Mrs. Margaret Peebles plunged her hypodermic of higher learning into Lord of the Flies and sucked out every drop of its primal magic, every trace of its adolescent wonder. Nothing new. Half the class hadn't even read the book. If they were judging it by what the teacher said, he could hardly blame them. But he'd read it 3 years ago, one summer afternoon in bed with a fever, and when he had put the book down, his hands had been shaking. Those wild, salty-skinned little boys had tumbled through his head, and he had cried for them. So young, grown old, so fast. He isn't Mary Sue. Okay. Jason, outside, far away across the wide green front lawn, past the pink granite sign that looked like a gravestone, except for the snarling tiger carved on top. Gift of the senior class, 1972. A black van sped by. Jason. He sighed. Peebles was staring at him. The rest of the class paid no attention. They were elsewhere too, in their own worlds, driving away on their own roads. What? He asked. We were discussing William Golding's Lord of the Flies. You have read the book. I have. Then perhaps you can tell me about the rivalry between Jack and Ralph. What allows it to grow so bitter? Their attraction for each other, nothing said. Their love for each other. They had this fierce love. They wanted to be each other. And only when you love someone that much can you hate them too. A ripple of laughter went through the class. Peebles pressed her thin lips together. If you had been paying attention instead of doodling and staring out the window. Suddenly he was too tired to care what happened to him. This was empty, all empty, useless crap. Oh, F you, he said, and felt the class suck in its breath and silently cheer him on. Half an hour later, sitting in the principal's office, waiting for the hand of petty academic fate to descend upon him, he thought again of the ghosts that had visited him last night. Visions or whiskey vapors. It didn't matter. You've got to get out of here, they told him. You've got to get out of here. After school, a bunch of kids met in the parking lot and went over to Lane Peterson's house to get stoned. Someone put a Bauhaus tape on and turned it all the way up. Lane and Julie rolled around on the bed, pretending to make out. Nothing suspected that Lane liked her mainly because of her superficial resemblance to Robert Smith. He looked around the room. Several of the kids were groping each other ineptly, kissing each other with sloppy, wet mouths. Gross. Gross. Why are we talking about this? Bisexuality was much in vogue among his crowd. It was one of the few ways they could feel daring. Nothing himself had made out with several of these kids, but though he had to stop it, none of them really interested him. The thought had made him sad, though he wasn't sure why. He lay back on the floor and stared up at a poster tacked on the ceiling above Lane's bed. Robert Smith's lips enlarged several thousand times, smeared with hot orange red lipstick, shiny and sexual. Nothing wished he could fall into them, could slide down Robert Smith's throat and curl up safe in his belly. The marijuana made him feel restless. He wanted to do 100 things at once, but none of them here. He realized that among these kids he called his friends, he felt much more alone than he had felt in his room last night. The party began to break up. As she was about to leave, Julie reached into her purse. You can have this, she told nothing. You said you liked it, and I never listened to it. Sounds like crap kicker music to me. She handed him a cheap, home-produced cassette tape. The crayon writing on the liner said, Lost Souls? Nothing's heart quickened. When he had heard this tape at Julie's house, something in it had sung out to him. He remembered a snatch of the lyrics. We are not afraid. Let the night come. We are not afraid. The singer's golden voice chanting those words had awakened in him a courage he didn't know he had, a belief that someday his life would be more than this. As soon as Julie was gone, Lane got up and put on a cure tape. Then he came and lay beside Nothing on the floor. His bleached white blonde hair fell in long strands over his eyes. His hand found Nothing's and squeezed. Nothing didn't squeeze back, but he didn't pull away. How am I gonna cut this up for content? Chapter 3. The road was long and hilly. The black van was hurtling along like a roller coaster, and the day was fine. Twig drove with an elbow cocked out the window. Malachi hung out the other side, gnawing on his sticky fingers, letting the wind blow in his face. Zillow lolled on a mattress in the back, luxuriating in the clear autumn warmth. The mattress was filthy, parts of its fabric caked with stiff stains that faded from dark maroon to nearly black. They would have to unload it at a dump and find a cleaner one soon. Malachi swiveled his head as they passed the school. Hey, kiddies! Twig swatted him. Small game. How boring. There'd be plenty to do at a high school. All those candy boys, all those sugar girls. A temple of boredom, Zillow offered from the back. He was braiding his hair. He kept a streak of it dyed purple, gold, and green, and he was weaving the 3 colored strands together, toying with the braid, then delicately pulling it apart with his fingers. Boredom is a sin. Boredom is unholy. Malachi snorted. What do you know about it? When have you ever been bored? I'm 100, said Zillah, studying his long fingernails critically. He produced a bottle of black nail polish and began painting his nails neatly, carefully. You two are only 75, but I am 100 years old this very year. I have been bored. I'm bored now. I'm 100. Twig reached under the driver's seat and found a bottle. And this wine was born last Tuesday. Let's drink to it. I'm 100, Molokai mumbled around the neck of the bottle. The wine was sticky, sweet as rotten grapes. He licked his lips and took another swig. They kept driving, kept drinking, never looked at a map. They did not need maps. The possibility of alternate routes, charted yellow and red and green roads, cryptic legends held no fascination for them. By some warm alcoholic magnetism in their blood, they were drawn on to the next city and the next. Twig always knew what roads to take, what highways he could roar along the fastest, what country blacktops were haunted by state troopers and God-fearing folk. They had just come from New York City, where they were able to sate their appetites every night on blood rich with strange drugs, where a hophead chick they met had let them sleep the days away in her East Village apartment until they grew careless and left a shredded mess in her bathtub. Kinky stuff was fine, she said, but she wasn't into death. And there were gore stains on her only set of towels. She had still been trying to decide how to get rid of the body when they sneaked out. It was true that Zilla was 100 and the others only 75. Even so, they were just teenagers by the standards of their race. Zilla had met them at an elegant garden party in the roaring 20s, a great Gatsby-ish affair with paper lanterns and drunken croquet games on the lawn. Molokai and Twig were huddled in a corner of the garden making fun of the women's fancy dresses. Whenever a waiter came by with a tray of champagne flutes, they would reach out and grab 2 glasses apiece, one in each hand. When Zilla approached them, they were too drunk to recognize him as one of their own, but they liked his pretty face and his natty suit of white linen. They led him into the big house, thinking they were luring him to his death, and tried to attack him in an upstairs parlor decorated entirely in animal skins and trophy heads. Zilla threw them across the room, hoisted them up, and cracked their heads together beneath the eternally roaring jaws of a stuffed lion. Then he opened a vein in his wrist and tenderly gave them to drink. After that, they were his forever, or nearly so. On the road again, Twig peeled off slices of bologna and stuffed them into his mouth, tossing his head like a feeding leopard as he swallowed, hardly chewing the soft meat. Molokai gulped sticky mouthfuls of cake and cream. Zilla licked at a sliver of bologna, nibbled delicately around the edges of a Twinkie, sipped from the bottle of Thunderbird. None of them were satisfied. Will we be in D.C. by tonight? Molokai asked, licking chocolate off his fingers. Twig stared at the road. Crap, we'll be there in an hour, but you can count on staying hungry till way after dark. No one bothered asking why. They knew where the best city pickings were, in the clubs, in the alleys, under the midnight moon. Yeah, Molokai managed a sticky smile, thinking of nights in the city. So we stay in D.C. for a couple of nights. Then what? Twig thought, we could check out California again. You like the ice cream shops in Chinatown. But that's so far, and the whole desert in between us and it. Nothing to eat, nothing to drink, no people, no blood. Zilla closed his eyes, stroked his eyelashes with the tip of one shiny black nail. We could drive down to New Orleans, he said. We could visit Christian. Twig's eyes lit up. Christian! Remember Christian? Good old Christian! He doesn't drink wine. They all laughed. Yeah, but he might still be tending bar. Free drinks. And everyone's blood full of wine and beer and whiskey. And chartreuse, said Zilla. They paused for a moment, tongues tasting a memory of altars, of the Garden of Eden. Let's do it. Let's go see good old Christian. Good old Chrissy, said Molokai. Chrissy! Twig collapsed in giggles over the wheel. Molokai turned the music back on, and they sang along with Bowie, leaning on each other, their voices soft and lilting as they got drunker. Zilla ran his hands through Molokai's hair, pulling out the knots. Twig grinned as the road stretched out ahead, long and smooth and magical, unrolling like a carpet all the way down to Christian's bar in New Orleans. Chapter 4. Nothing is happening. Cat break. Chapter 5. 15 years later, Christian's bar was not so very different than it had been on that last night of Mardi Gras, that night of blood and altars, that delicious night. One of the stained glass windows had been broken in a fight on a rare evening when the bar was crowded and the liquor flowed too freely and tempers reached a sodden, white-hot pitch. Christian never found a replacement for the antique glass. The window was covered with black cardboard. It kept the sunlight out during the daytime, kept the shadows in at night. Upstairs, in Christian's room, the bloodstains Jesse had left on the carpet grew pale brown and edgeless as Christian walked over them in black leather boots and slippers with his bare, long-toed, knobby feet. 15 years of his footsteps wore Jesse's blood away. Gross. The tawdry, alcoholic, glorious life of the French Quarter went on way up, sharp. It's been so long I've already forgotten how to say the word. Charters? Charters. I think it was charters. Far away. No one ever came in before 10. The man came to the bar one night, early in September, during a late heat wave. He had rolled up the sleeves of his white cotton shirt, and the cloth at his armpits was circled with sweat. At first, Christian thought he was an old man, by the usual standards at any rate. A very old, sad, tired man. Then he looked again and saw that the man could not be much older than 50. But this was a man who carried himself as if expecting blows, a man turned inward, looking out at the world through guarded eyes. His clipped, curly hair was only beginning to go from brown to gray. He had a face that might once have been kind, deep, careworn lines, brown eyes that had seen too much pain. There was still warmth in those eyes, but it was warmth dampened with wariness and watchfulness. Christian thought that whatever this man chose to drink, he would take it straight, and he would take a lot of it. "Scotch," said the man. Christian poured it over ice. The man held the glass up to the light, frowned into its amber depths. Then he brought it to his lips and tossed the whiskey in one practiced motion. Then he looked at Christian and said, "My name is Wallace Creech," and held out his hand. "Christian," said Christian, taking the hand. He looked straight into Wallace's eyes. Wallace stared back, unflinching. Most people started at the touch of Christian's fingers and withdrew quickly, rubbing their hands against their clothing to rid themselves of Christian's icy touch, glancing away from the cold light of Christian's eyes. But Wallace looked steadily back, grasped Christian's hand harder, and said, "A fine name." "Another drink?" Christian asked. Wallace tossed back another shot, then surprised Christian by asking, "Is business always this slow?" Then, realizing what he had said, he tried to apologize. "I didn't mean to be rude. I was only curious. It's a nice place, a good location, the French Quarter." The man was babbling, and Christian realized that, for some reason, Wallace Creech was terrified. "Why are you here, Wallace Creech?" Christian asked softly. "What do you want?" Wallace's hand went to the cross at his throat. Then, as if trying to conceal the gesture, he ran a finger around the inside of his collar, loosening it, although the top button was already undone. "There was a girl once," he said. "Jessie. Small, thin, short brown hair, black dress. She used to come here." Christian felt a cold fist squeezed shut somewhere deep inside him. The fist twisted, clenched. It was wrapped around some vital part of him, tearing him loose inside. He licked his lips. His mouth tasted of sour blood. He pretended to think. "Jessie," he said. "Jessie. Such a long time ago. But perhaps I remember. She stopped coming in 15 years ago." "Was that after Mardi Gras, 15 years ago?" "I think so," said Christian, and tasted the sour blood again. "She was my daughter," said Wallace. Christian swallowed. He was suddenly thirsty. "And she just disappeared?" he asked. "Didn't you call the police?" "I didn't. No. Jessie was wild. She was forever threatening to leave home, saying I didn't give her enough money, saying I was dull. She liked to go out and drink. She was angry because I made her continue with school when she wanted to drop out. She didn't seem to care about anything. Certainly not her father. When Jessie disappeared, I thought she had run off with a boy. I hoped she would come back when his money was gone. She had such strange notions, such very strange notions, and sending the police after her would have made her hate me." "Why are you here now?" Christian couldn't look at Wallace's eyes. He stared at the silver cross, at the soft, loose skin of the man's throat behind it. "After Jessie left, I moved all her things to the attic. While I was going through the boxes, I found an old diary. The entries mentioned you several times in your bar. She seemed to have feelings for you. I thought she might have told you where she was going. I'd so love to see her now." "I don't know," said Christian. "She only drank here. She didn't talk to me. I've no idea where she went." He realized that he was still staring at the crucifix and dropped his gaze to Wallace's empty glass. Wallace gave a hearty sigh. "I'll have another," he said. He stayed to drink 2 more whiskeys, getting drunker, wandering around the bar. When Wallace began staring at the door that led to the staircase and beyond that to Christian's room, Christian picked up his rag and started wiping down the bar. "I'm closing up. I'm sorry I couldn't help you with your problem." His voice was sharper than he had meant it to be. Then Wallace was gone. He left with a quiet, swaying dignity, and the door locked after him. Christian turned to his rows of bottles and found a squat, embossed bottle nearly full of luminous green liqueur. No one wanted chartreuse, not anymore, but Christian always kept a few bottles of it in case Malachi, Twig, and Zilla came rolling into town some Mardi Gras night. They would want chartreuse, Christian knew. Tonight, he wanted it too. He wanted so badly to be drunk, to sleep. The others, Malachi, Twig, and Zilla, drank incessantly, even ate. They drowned their true natures in gluttony, but they were young. They were of a newer generation. Their chemistry was subtly different. They were hardier, their organs perhaps more thick-walled, less delicate. Christian remembered the time he had drunk wine, the time he had drunk vodka, and the memory of pain shivered up his spine. But perhaps this? Christian clutched the bottle to his chest and carried it up the stairs with him, turning off the bar lights as he went, ascending in the dark, a blessing of excellent night vision. When the first noise floated up from the alley, Christian was drunk enough to ignore it. It was only a bump. But then there was another bump and a scraping clatter that hurt to hear, as if someone were dragging one of the metal garbage cans across the concrete. Apparently Wallace Creech was still drunk too. Nothing else could account for the clumsiness with which he was going through Christian's garbage, mostly empties from the bar. This was too much. Wallace Creech would have to be dealt with more harshly. The alley was already strewn with broken glass, wrinkled paper bags, and other trash. But what was Wallace looking for? His daughter's bones, picked clean and wrapped in at times picayune 15 years out of date. The first spasm hit him as he was opening the door to the landing. It bent him nearly double. He leaned against the jamb, clutching himself, trying to hold in the blaze of green agony that was burning its way through his belly. This was worse than the other times, so much worse. Surely the pain must be ripping him apart inside, webbing his innards with tiny, bloody holes. His eyes squeezed shut, and a long shudder ran through him. Jesus, barkeep, are you going to live? Have to close up early tonight? Christian managed to nod. He leaned against David. The warm pressure of David's hand on his shoulder kept him from collapsing. He vomited again, having to force it this time. After that, he felt almost good. I'm going out, he told David. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Are you sure? How about I help you to your room? Don't you even want to brush your teeth? No, I need a drink to kill the taste. I must have eaten something bad. I'm meeting a girl. Why don't you come and have a drink with us? At the mention of alcohol, Christian had to suppress a moan. The idea of having a drink with David and his girl made him feel terribly lonely. He could never do such a thing, and besides, now he was ravenous. Now the music that drifted out of the doorway and up toward the moon was sparse and dark and strange, the anthem of all the lost children who began their lives at night, when the bars opened and the music began to play. When the boy cupped his hand around his mouth and went on tiptoe to shout something in Christian's ear, his name perhaps, though Christian never caught it, Christian laid his hand flat against the small of the boy's back. Through the t-shirt damp with sweat, the boy's skin was hot, alive. Christian felt the little ridges of the spine through the thin cloth. The boy looked at Christian for a moment, his eyes darker than before. Then he smiled and moved so that his hip was touching Christian's. Their hip bones met and spoke to each other in a secret bone language. The boy's smile was heartbreakingly sweet. I don't like this. The water shone dark and still tonight. Near its edge, the boy spread his jacket and pulled Christian down with him. Their tongues melted together. What are you doing? The boy twisted his head to look at Christian. His eyes were big in his thin face and very dark. What are you? He asked. Christian was silent, but his teeth had pricked the boy's skin, and the first faint scent of blood reached him. Are you a vampire? Christian stroked the boy's hair back from his forehead, kissed the side of the boy's face tenderly. Make me into one too, said the boy. Please? I want to be one. I want to walk at night with you and fall in love and drink blood. Kill me. Make me into a vampire too. Bite me. Take me with you. I'm not reading that. When the boy's veins ran dry and his hair and hands trailed limply on the wet ground, Christian picked him up and held him like a baby, gazing into the face gone paler than before, the rapturous half-closed eyes. For several minutes he held the boy, and then he turned his cold eyes to the cold moon, and something passed between them, between Christian and the moon, something as ancient and implacable as the tides, as the distances between the stars. It was kinder to let the children die believing as they did. He could not turn the boy into one of his kind any more than the boy could have bitten him and turned him human. They were of separate races, races that were close enough to mate but still as far away from each other as dusk and dawn. But the dead slept and did not know. Christian kissed the white forehead and eased the empty little body into the river. The weight of the leather dragged it down, and for a moment Christian saw it hanging beneath the surface, limp and cold as a dream. Then it was gone. Chapter 6. His parents were both at work, his mother counseling disturbed children at a daycare center, his father doing something that had vaguely to do with finance. The house was sunny and still, and all that afternoon he searched through their desk drawers, through their files and boxes, looking for his adoption papers. He had to know who his real parents were. He had to know where he had come from and whether someday he might find his way back. The paper was thick and cream-colored, with 2 small holes at the top as if it had been pinned to something. Slowly he deciphered the spidery handwriting. His name is nothing. Care for him, and he will bring you luck. All at once the story fell into place around him. A baby in a basket, abandoned on 2 strangers' doorsteps some night. That was what he had been. Surely this note had been pinned to his blanket. But the strangers had taken him in, changed his name, tried to make him into one of their kind. If he had brought them any luck at all, that luck had surely been bad. It was all so clear now. It was all so right. The next day, he put the note back in the drawer in case Mother ever looked there. But when he was alone in the house, he took it out and read it again and again, holding the paper to his face, pressing it against his mouth, trying to catch the scent of the place it had come from. For that was where he had been born. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the hand that had shaped those spindling black words, for that hand belonged to someone who knew him, who had held him. In the veins of that hand, his blood might flow. Nothing rummaged through his backpack and found the cassette Julie had given him. He put it on now. The singer's voice wove in and out of the jangly guitar line, now losing itself in the music, now as strong and golden green as some Appalachian summer mountain stream. Does your road go no place? Does it go someplace where you can't see? If you follow it anyway, it just might lead you here to me. Somewhere in the music, perhaps outside the window in the cold night, somewhere above the melody and under the moon, those lonely little ghosts started whispering to him again. You've got to get out of here. You've got to find your place, your family, before you rot and die. All right, he said, after listening for a while. All right. All at once he knew he had to leave. It was inevitable, and he wondered what he had been waiting for. He rolled over, hugged himself, then felt under his mattress and pulled out a single-edged razor blade. Nothing lay under his charred quilt in his own safe room for the last time, and he sucked at his own blood because that was what comforted him, what he had always done when he grew too lonely, too hungry for something he did not know. At last, when his lips were stained red and a thin pink line of blood and spit trickled from the corner of his mouth, he was able to sleep. Chapter 7. I'm going to be a vampire, Daddy. Wallace shut his eyes tight and shook his head. Begone, Jesse, he muttered. Torment me no more. His hands came up hard against the side of the brick building that housed Christian's bar, and he pushed himself away from the wall and staggered out of the alley. I'm going to be a vampire, Daddy. It was all she had spoken of for weeks. Finding a vampire to bite her, turning into one, drinking the blood of others. Her lovers, Wallace supposed, the lovers he didn't know, and turning them into vampires as well. Her things spoke of this obsession, too. Jessie had always been quite a reader, turning the pages of Charlotte's Web and the Bobbsey twins' books with scowling concentration, but now the stack of books by her bed was all vampire stories. Dracula was there, dog-eared and heavily underlined. Wallace had looked at the book one night while Jessie was out at one of her haunts. Some passages were circled over and over, in pencil and lipstick, in what looked like blood. Daddy, she called softly. Daddy. Wallace looked at the old sign in Jessie's bedroom door, a cartoon rabbit in rainbow-spattered overalls painting the words genius at work, then turned the knob and stepped out of the dark hallway into brightness. Jessie's room always caught the morning sunlight. She'd just come out of the shower, and her skin was as pink and white and dewy as spring. Her hair fell wet and straight along her cheeks. As he stared at her, she let the green towel fall from her I don't want to read this. I'm going to be a vampire, Daddy. He could not find his voice. There was no spit in his mouth. Put your clothes on, Jessie. It was a dry whisper, weak and useless. I'm going to bite people, Daddy. I'm going to feed on them. I need blood. Hot, rich, red blood. I need your blood, Daddy. I'm hungry. Your Jessie's hungry. Come to me. He awoke tangled in Jessie's rumpled sheets that smelled of girl's skin. There was a nick on his throat, no worse than a bad shaving cut, smeared with dried blood and spit. He did not wash it. Jessie was gone. After a few nights, he began to look for her in all the places she had mentioned, all the nighttime haunts, the dark bars and clubs in the French Quarter. He did not know what he would say if he saw Jessie. He did not know whether he would be able to meet his daughter's eyes, but that did not matter, for he never saw Jessie again. More and more often during his search, he found himself drawn to the place called Christian's, the dark bar with the stained glass windows that threw colored shadows onto the sidewalk. When Wallace watched Christian study the impossibly tall, gaunt, pale figure always dressed in black, the idea of Jesse's vampires no longer seemed quite so preposterous. Wallace could not forget those eyes. When he'd seen them again tonight, he had felt the same icy hand, the same helpless fury. Wallace believed in vampires now. Tonight he would avenge her, and he would have his memories of her again, his memories of a child who danced and laughed, of a child who loved him, who was not a dark creature of sex and blood. He would eradicate his darnable sin. He would redeem himself. The air sobered him. He drew himself up, refused to sway, refused to let his dizziness and fear overtake him. Tonight belonged to him and to Jesse. He walked toward the river. Chapter 8. Twig kept up a steady string of curses as they drove into D.C. The streets seemed skewed to him, the signs indecipherable. Finally, he turned the wrong way down a one-way street, screeched to a halt in front of a fancy hotel, and said, "That's where we're staying." In the foamy waters of the whirlpool, Zilla pulled Molokai and Twig to him and dipped his tongue into their mouths, sweet with cake and cream, sharp and sour with champagne. Once more they began their game of spit and skin and passion, of slippery hands and soft bites and sometimes harder bites. They played the game they knew so well, the game they had played for such a long time, and when they were done, Molokai and Twig snuggled against Zilla in the steamy swirling water, their heads on his shoulders, their hands linked across his chest. The three closed their eyes and dreamed their warm, bloody dreams. For a few hours they could rest, and then it would be time to go out and party again. When the sun set, Zilla sent the valet to get their van. They drove to Georgetown, taking wrong turns, being stopped by streets that suddenly turned one way, weaving around and around traffic circles, swaying against each other every time the van navigated a curve. They had drunk more champagne back at the hotel, and by this time they were too blasted to care whether they got lost. It was Twig who found the girl. He had a nose for Indian curry. The window was painted Calcutta Palace in a flowing, strange script. Below it, a sign said closed, but the door swung open when Twig pushed at it. As Twig watched, the girl raised her arm and pulled her heavy black hair back over one shoulder. The movement wafted a cloud of her scent to him. He could smell the oil of her hair, the sweat of her armpits, the odors of grease and spice and sandalwood that were a part of her being. And he could smell the dusky blood beneath the skin, hot and peppery, as exotic as all India. Her blood would taste of chili and almonds, of cardamom, of rosewater. Okay. Sure. Cool. He motioned to the other two, and they slid forward, moving as one creature, fused in this act of killing. The girl turned and flung up her hands, but Twig's mouth stopped her cry, and they fell upon her. As Malachi burrowed under her long cotton skirt and bit into his favorite spot, Twig cracked the bones of the girl's throat between his teeth and tasted spice. Chapter 9. When Christian turned away from the river, Wallace was there, several feet away, watching him. Wallace had seen him with the boy. Christian's first emotion was not anger or fear, but shame, terrible, fiery shame. Wallace had caught him at his most secret, most vulnerable moment, and Christian wanted to sink to the ground and cover himself to shut his eyes tight, to vanish. The moonlight ravaged Wallace's face. The hollows beneath his eyes grew deeper, the lines bracketing his mouth more harsh. The silver cross at his throat gleamed, and his hand went to it. "Vampire," he said, spitting the word out, making it ugly. "Filthy, cursed thing." "You knew," said Christian. "The story you told me. It was all made up. You didn't find her diary. You weren't suddenly seized with a desire to see her after such a long time. You knew." Wallace's eyes glittered, dark, never leaving Christian's. "I did." "You look very much the proper vampire, Christian," Wallace went on, and Christian wondered whether he was supposed to take that as a compliment. "But I still could not quite believe. I was unsure. My religion does not acknowledge the supernatural. It considers such matters unholy, and consequently, it ignores them. So one night I waited until you closed your bar down, and when you went out, I followed you. I saw you speak to a boy near Jackson Square, a young boy with long hair who wore beads around his neck. I followed the two of you to the river. I saw you do what you did to the other boy tonight, and I wondered how many other children you had put in the river, and I thought of Jesse's body sinking out of sight there, in that cold brown water." Wallace's voice broke. In an instant he realized who had killed Jesse. Zillah had, with the seduction of his hands and his lips, with his fertile... Gross. Or so Wallace would see it. No, Wallace would not understand the drunkenness that comes with blood or the light in the Mardi Gras sky. He could see only the image of Zillah's hands on Jesse's fragile body. Zillah, with those languid, graceful hands, with those glowing green eyes, and the rest of that loud, happy trio Christian had not seen for 15 years, though he had looked for them every night of every Mardi Gras when the bright costumes staggered in, and the laughter was high and drunken, and the liquor flowed in the gutters. He would deal with Wallace himself, and he would protect his kind. He did not love what he did, but for too long he had been alone in doing it. Christian nodded and took a step toward Wallace. Wallace didn't back away this time. I have no reason to fear you any more. Wallace shut his eyes, then opened them. You are a godless thing, and you will die for that. 15 years ago, I did not have the courage to avenge Jesse, but nothing else matters to me now. He unfastened the crucifix from his throat and stepped toward Christian, brandishing it at the end of his chain. Begone from the face of God's earth, foul creature, thing of night, sucker at death's teat. Christian shook his head sadly. He did not laugh, but there was a trace of amused contempt in his eyes. Wallace stopped chanting and lowered his arm. The crucifix swung from his hand, shimmering when the moonlight caught it. You are a fool, said Christian. You are a fool, and your myths are wrong. If you touched me with that, it would not burn me. It would not blacken my skin. It would not poison my essence. I have nothing against your Christ. I am sure his blood tasted as sweet as anyone else's. Undead soul, said Wallace, not quite subtly. No, I am alive. I was born as you were born. Well, not quite. Christian thought of the mother he had never seen, wondered whether he had left her as torn and bloody as Jesse had been. I am not the creature of your myths. I did not rise from the grave. I have never been one of your race, Wallace Creech. I am of a different one. Christian lowered his head and brushed his lips against Wallace's throat, and suddenly he found himself wishing that all the ancient human myths were true. He had seen no others of his kind in 15 years, since Molokai, Twig, and Zillah appeared by some Mardi Gras magic and left again when the sun set on Ash Wednesday. Christian wished he had the power that the legends ascribed to him. He wished his victims could rise again and run with him, others of his kind to share the smell of the streets past midnight, the long hot days with the shades drawn, the taste of the sweet, fresh blood. Even Wallace would do, even old tired Wallace with the pain in his eyes. He put his mouth against Wallace's throat. The skin there was dry, loose. It smelled of age. He bit down and tasted blood for the second time that night. But it was bitter. It was foul, and he spat it back against Wallace's throat and gagged. Christian's nostrils flared. He had not detected it before, under the stinging mist of whiskey and sorrow, but now it was obvious, strong and rank. The smell of sickness, deep rotting sickness that rioted through Wallace's body, as wet and brown as the smell of the river. Some virulent disease, probably a cancer. The taste was corruption in his mouth. If that had been all, Christian could have fled or fought. He was very strong, surely stronger than Wallace. But a second later, the nausea hit him, worse than the drunken sickness brought on by the chartreuse, worse than the sharp immediacy of that pain. Through the haze of sickness, he was aware of Wallace pulling something from behind his back, something that had been tucked into the waistband of his trousers. The object caught the moon and became a thing of pure light, a slim pistol shining white and silver. He saw Wallace taking aim and closed his eyes. Then the night exploded, and pain slammed into Christian's chest. He could not breathe. His last thought before the pain and the sickness washed his mind away was one of regret. 383 years, such a very long time. He should have been beautiful, not this sad, old, tired man. He should have been lovely. Chapter 10. Nothing hurried through the circle of brilliance made by a streetlight and slipped into the deserted darkness again. He pulled his raincoat around him. Oh, sensuous black silk, as erotic as the touch of someone else's skin, and hoisted his heavy backpack on his shoulders. He was forcing himself to be absolutely silent, making a game of it so that he would not have to think too hard about what he had left behind. His room and all the things in it, most of his tapes, most of his books, all his records and old toys and the stars on his ceiling. He thought of the stars still glowing there, lonely pinpoints of light above his empty bed, and he wondered if he would ever again sleep beneath a ceiling of painted yellow stars. He put on the Lost Souls cassette. The music was soft and wailing, the singer's voice pulling him down south, Down along the ways the trains traveled, down through the green land. Nothing wondered whether these musicians might be his family, his long-lost brothers. He thought again of the eerie-sounding town where they lived. Maybe he would go there. A whole lot of nothing. Just a whole lot of nothing happening. The bus smelled of cigarettes and prickly upholstery and some heavy, sweet disinfectant. Nothing decided he liked the odor. A few heads lifted to stare blearily at him, then drooped back against the dark windows. He took a seat in the back and lit a cigarette. The bus shuddered, heaved a sigh, and pulled away from the station. Nothing smiled at himself in the window. He was on his way. His journey had begun. He was already a little closer to home. Chapter 11. Several hours after Nothing climbed the steps of a Greyhound bus in Maryland, Christian opened his eyes and saw dawn bleeding palely across the New Orleans sky. Disappointing. Get back here. Kill him for real. Come on. Christian sat up and examined himself. There was a scorched hole in the fine black cloth of his shirt, its edges perfectly round. He undid the top 2 buttons. The bullet had shattered the 3rd one. In the center of his chest was a shiny pink scar, the skin pulled tight and slightly rippled. There would be no matching scar on his back. Wallace's bullet was still in him, and there it would stay. It was not the first. But the fury faded even as he recognized it, and Christian sat quietly in the breaking light for several minutes, resting his head on his drawn-up knees, unable to identify his new emotion. As he pushed himself to his feet and gathered his cloak around him, he realized what this was. His reaction to waking healed and alive and still alone. It was disappointment. The sidewalk seemed to stretch endlessly before him, shimmering and baking in the sunlight. Surely his bar was just ahead. He groped along the wall. He had to rely on his sense of smell, but the melange of odors confused him. He could not tell. I want to cut this. I don't care. He could not tell where he was. Was the bar in this block or the next? For a long time he stood in the lightening gloom of the bar, breathing the dark dust, the ghosts of liquor and beer and all the drinkers who had been here. If he breathed in deeply enough, he thought he would still catch the scent of Wallace Creech, the dry, sick smell. Wallace, poor Wallace, who thought he had killed his nemesis, his daughter's supernatural defiler. What would he do when he discovered otherwise? But his eyes were sore, exhausted. He climbed the stairs to his room and burrowed into bed, into his own comforting, familiar smell. This had happened so many times before. He might live in a place for 5 years or 50 before anyone became suspicious of him, but someone always became suspicious, and he always moved on. It was easier than trying to hide from them. It made him less heartsick than fighting them. When he was young, he had fought them, and he had never lost, but he always had to kill so many. Eventually, he realized that when he was not killing for lust and hunger, he hated it. Breaking the fragile span of their 40 or 50 or 80 years made him feel vicious and cruel. He could outlast them. He could return long after they were dust and bones. Christian packed a very small bag. Oh my God. Do we even need this chapter? God. Just have him, like, he didn't even need to have the, and then he woke up. Like, I didn't need to see that. Just show him in another town and like, oh yeah, no, he lived. Sorry, he should have went for his heart or his brain, but Wallace didn't, so Christian's fine. Like, it's just, oh my God, this chapter is so long. Christian packed a very small bag. There was little to pack. For a long time now, possessions had seemed fleeting and cumbersome, and his room was almost bare. He brought his day clothes, his hat and gloves and glasses, and he brought the money he had saved from the bar. He could get more money when he needed it. There was always work for a good bartender. With a glimmer of hope, he put 3 bottles of chartreuse in his bag. There was no telling whom he might meet on the road. Inside the strip club, spangles gyrated and flashed. Christian stopped his car for a crowd of people milling across the street. Soldiers, tourists, street corner musicians, and the omnipresent children in black. He had seen those pale, smudged faces before, in the clubs, in his arms. But no, those had been different faces. Most of the crowd was drunk. Some turned and waved at Christian, and he lifted a gloved hand in return, half smiling. Surely those could not be tears on his face. He had not cried in too many years. He could not remember what crying felt like. This was only leftover rain, dripping from his hair, pooling in his eyes. Christian waved goodbye to the Bourbon Street crowd and wiped the rain from his cheeks. Then he turned north and drove out of the town. Chapter 12. I don't want to read more of this. I don't like Steve. I don't like him. I don't like him. What other commentary do you need? I don't like Steve. I don't like him. Yeah, he sucks. Another character who should have just been murdered by Wallace, and I would have been fine. Yeah, he sucks. He sucks so bad. That was a crappy thing Steve did to you. You could have called the cops on him or told your father. What stopped you? That was a crappy thing Steve did to you. Why didn't you call the cops? Are we sure Ghost is good? Ghost believed her, but she still hadn't told him what he really wanted to know. How come you did it, Anne? You loved Steve. Maybe you still do. How come you wanted to go running to that guy over in Corinth? That's what you care about? I hate this. Ghost couldn't say much to that. Her point of view still bothered him. Does it? Does it, Ghost? Does it? I don't like Ghost anymore. Chapter 13. Nothing fingered the colored glass bubbles in the partition between diner booths of torn maroon vinyl. The Greyhound had taken him down through Maryland and Northern Virginia suburbs, down along anonymous highways flanked by chemical processing plants, cigarette mills, housing developments, and the dull blue and green aluminum walls meant to protect them from the noise and smell of the highway. He finished his cigarette, lit another, tried to make out the time through the layer of grease on the wall clock, glanced over at the bus station again. But it was no good. He couldn't get back on a bus even if he wanted to. The money from his mother's jewelry box had run out 2 towns ago. His stomach hurt, and he had thought of spending his one remaining dollar on a burger or some pancakes. But what if it was the last dollar he ever got? He had to save it for something he really wanted. A new notebook, a cup of expensive coffee, a black slouch hat in a thrift store somewhere. To save his single dollar for something cool, not food. You had to spend your last dollar on something important. An hour's worth of cars went by, sleek and faceless, windows rolled up against the coming night. He had almost decided to go back and try to sleep in the bus station when the Lincoln Continental screeched to a stop beside him. The car was unwieldy and enormous, salmon pink splotched with great wound-like patches of rust. A rope trailed from the rear bumper, unraveling, its end stained dark. The car's interior, once white maybe, reeked of something rancid. As he got in, nothing saw the green plastic Jesus on the dashboard, but before he could reconsider, the driver leaned across him and pulled the passenger door shut. Nothing realized suddenly what the rancid smell was: sour milk. It made him think of the dumpsters behind the school cafeteria when they hadn't been dumped for a while. "Where are you headed?" After a moment's hesitation, the driver added, "Son?" "Missing Mile," he said. It was the only place he could think of on a second's notice. North Carolina. The man nodded and turned back to the road. Heard about the place. Maggot's nest of sin, nightclubs and bars, fast women. He scowled at the highway. Nothing looked more closely at the driver. He seemed very white. His face was unlined and pale, with a kind of crazy, exalted beauty to it, but the hair that hung in it was the color of flat, hard-packed ice. The man's hands were as spindly as 2 white spiders on the steering wheel, and the pale wrists disappeared into folds of cloth as white as milk. Was he wearing robes? White robes. What? The white hands skittered on the wheel. "Have you been saved?" "Crap," said Nothing softly. "What was that?" Nothing looked out the window at a graying landscape. Born Agains made him into a smart aleck. "Yeah, I was saved once, at a party. I was almost sober. Then my friend gave me another drink. I could tell you were a sinner from the minute you climbed in. Christ shows them to me, and it's my duty to save them. I got to do it. I got to do it." The driver's voice sounded almost frightened now. "You got to read. It's my duty to make you." Nothing picked up the tract again. As he shifted in his seat, his foot crushed something on the floor. Now he could see where the sour smell came from. Dozens of empty milk cartons littered the floorboards, some fresh, some faded with age. Missing children smiled sunnily up at him, refusing to acknowledge that now they were probably just scattered bones in a couvert somewhere. Oh, what? What is this? Why is this car filled with milk cartons? What is happening? Nothing took a deep breath and opened the track. The paper felt slick and cheap between his fingers. What is eternal life, he began. Go on, the driver told him. His breathing had begun to quicken. An hour later, it was full dark outside the dusty windows. The Lincoln was cruising at 80. The albino had made him read 4 more tracts, and between that and the sour milk odor, nothing's throat felt as if someone had poured hot sand down it. If the albino was going to kill him and dump him in a ditch somewhere, they might as well get it over with. If he stopped now, maybe he'd still be able to scream. I can't go anymore, he said, afraid to look at the albino. Instead, he stared out the window. The Lincoln's one working headlight picked out a line of bright orange cones by the side of the road. Highway work. The cones flashed by, slower, slower. Gravel crunched beneath the wheels. The car came to a full stop. The white spider was crawling up his thighs, squeezing. Now you're gonna go over what you've learned, the man said again. Suddenly, nothing wasn't scared anymore. The situation was familiar. Why didn't you just tell me what you wanted instead of making me read all that crap? It's my duty, the man said, but his voice shook. His hand tightened on Nothing's leg. Nothing didn't care what he had to do. Whatever it was, it would be worth it to get away from this sour-smelling car, those lonely cardboard smiles. The albino's jewel-pink eyes slipped shut as Nothing bent over his lap and pulled his robes aside. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. The albino gave Nothing $5. 5 lousy dollars. Nothing amended silently, but the night air refreshed him as he pushed open the heavy door and he got out fast, before the man could decide that he wasn't quite saved yet, that another round of tract reading might do the trick. The salmon-pink Continental rolled slowly away, the stained rope trailing from its rear bumper, leaving Nothing alone on the roadside. At last he staggered into an abandoned barn. Great pronged shapes loomed around him, abandoned farm machinery, heavy and rusted. It might fall on him in the night, pin him to the musty floor, leave him to struggle and die alone. He didn't care. The rain raised dust and cobwebby chaff in the barn. Nothing sneezed once, twice, 3 times. Hard, choking spasms that bent him double. The third sneeze turned into a loud sob. He curled up beneath the loft and sucked at the blood on his hand. His tears soaked into the dirty wooden floor. During the night, while Nothing dreamed uneasy dreams, a small spider climbed delicately through his wet black hair. It let itself down along the smooth line of his jawbone, lingered briefly on his lips, and ran away over the damp red-streaked fingers that Nothing pressed to his mouth, his tongue darting out to lick the blood away as he slept. Chapter 14. It was still hot when Christian drove into Missing Mile. He did not know he was in Missing Mile, not yet, for the road he came in on had no town limit sign. The sign, a splintered pine plank with its painted letters aged to translucence, had been knocked down 20 years ago by a man who decided to take 2 lovers that night. Yes, Medusa. Give the people what they want. The sign, a splintered pine plank with its painted letters aged to translucence, had been knocked down 20 years ago by a man who decided to take 2 lovers that night. His head lay against Vodka's breast and his hand was on Whiskey's thigh when he lost control of his car. Okay, that was a bit much. The sign lay several feet from the road, swathed in kudzu, stained brown with blood long dry. So Christian did not know he was in the town, not yet. He knew only that he was almost out of money somewhere in North Carolina, that his fuel gauge was hovering on empty, and that all day the sun had threatened to emerge from low-hanging clouds. This, then, was where he would stop for a while. We're like 33% through, and like, all of the horror has just been gasp, shock. Like, I'm sorry, am I supposed to be scared by a little girl with like Downs or something just standing by the side of the road with a toy? Like, they're like, I'm sorry, does mental, like, does disability scare you? It doesn't scare me. Why is this in here? Why are we being mean to a little girl with a doll? Come on, Christian, get it together. This was one of the few gazes that could meet his own. It did not fear because it did not know. Okay. You're doing it. I'm horrified. Good job. Good job. Wait. Was she like holding a rat? Oh, I thought it was a doll. Oh, she was touching roadkill. Oh, well, that's more unsettling, but I think it's most unsettling to have a little girl holding roadkill and saying she's creepy because of her disability. Actually, yeah, fuck you. He was looking for dark windows, for neon beer signs lit deep within shadowy interiors. There must be a bar. Somewhere in this town must be a place where the townspeople could drink, fight, pass all the long hot nights, spend their paydays away. Any redneck bar would do. Christian was beginning to wonder whether he might not be in one of the dreaded dry counties of the South when a blue beer light caught his eye at last. The door of the place was a thick slab of pine carved with twisted letters, the sacred U. He eased the Bel Air over to the curb. There was always work for a good bartender. That same night, Christian fell back into the routine of popping bottle tops, tapping kegs, and drawing foamy draft beer into plastic cups, replying to small talk without really hearing it. Gradually and gratefully, he came to realize that this was no redneck bar. He saw children in black, which he had not expected in a small southern town, and he watched them and began to know their faces. But he would wait. Some of these children might be drifters or flotsam from the State University in Raleigh, but he could not afford to be greedy too soon. He had waited before. Soon someone would come to town, alone and a stranger, someone he could take safely. Christian would stay in Missing Mile as long as he could, and when he had saved some money, he would fill the tank of his Bel Air and start driving north again. North was where Molokai, Twig, and Zilla might be, and he still thought of finding them. Chapter 15. By 10 o'clock the next morning, Nothing was so hungry and lonely that he almost cried from sheer relief when the biker stopped and picked him up. "Where are you headed?" the biker asked. The question already seemed familiar. Missing Mile, North Carolina. Nothing wasn't sure if he was really going there, but the name had become a sort of talisman. "Yeah, I'm going to Danville. That's almost over the Carolina border. Hop on." Nothing had never been on a motorcycle before, though he had always wished he could drive one. This was a heavy bike, chopped and channeled, chrome winking through the layer of highway dirt. Nothing stood looking at the machine until the biker said, "You want to ride or not?" "Yeah, sure." Nothing looked up into the biker's face. White blonde hair going dark at the roots, frazzled by wind, no crash helmet, enormous hollow eyes as round and glowing as a bush baby's. "What's your name?" Nothing asked. "Spooky," the biker told him, and it seemed right. Around noon, they stopped in a little town and got a bucket of fried chicken, which they ate in an old, tumble-down graveyard some miles down the highway. "Crab," said Spooky. "Are you cool? I need to fix." He mimed jabbing something into the vein of his arm. "Oh," said Nothing, understanding. "Oh, sure, I'm cool." He tried to look cool. "Who do you think I'd tell? Just gotta be sure, you never know." Spooky dug through the pockets of his jacket and pulled out several objects that I'm not going to describe. Spooky was completely gone now. He slumped against the vault, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow, harsh. His mouth was slightly open. Nothing moved closer to Spooky, moved so close that he was almost on top of the biker. Instead, he picked up Spooky's limp arm and bit at the soft skin of the inner elbow, where Spooky had fixed. The vein was already open, and the blood began to flow easily. From somewhere deep in his stupor, Spooky whimpered, and Nothing pressed closer and licked the last of the blood away. He couldn't take too much. He didn't know how much would be dangerous. Never mind that he wanted to eat Spooky, to swallow him whole. The junk-laced blood tasted so good, so pure. It might rain again. Nothing picked up the leather jacket and carefully covered Spooky with it. He knew he couldn't stay here until the biker came to. He might notice the fresh wound, and Spooky would probably beat the crap out of him. Maybe it was the effect of the heroin, but what he had done did not seem strange to him. Erotic, yes. Sneaky and a little mean, yes, but not strange. He had wanted the blood. He had even been hungry for it, and it had made him feel better, had settled his stomach, just as the albino's stuff had. Then the van jolted into reverse and pulled up next to him. 3 heads swiveled to look at Nothing, 3 clumps of hair, 3 faces defined in blots of dark makeup. Their hands clawed at the windows and their mouths opened, laughing, and for a moment Nothing thought they would drive away and leave him staring after the van, his foot already on the asphalt, his skin ready for warmth. But then the passenger door opened and one of the figures swayed toward him, spat hair out of its mouth, and said, "Hi, want a ride?" "I'm Twig," said the driver. His voice was low and amused, and his sidelong smile was as quick and sharp as a blade. "The bum here is Molokai, and the pretty one in the back, that's Zilla." I wish that had been the reintroduction of their characters. Like, we didn't see them until they were right there, and it was just pure coincidence. But that would have taken down the word count. I don't really care about them, like, deciding to go to DC or whatever and stand around and get horny in a hotel room together. I don't care about that. Like, a lot of this book is just kind of, it's not like empty of things, but it feels longer than it needs to be. Twig steered the van with one hand and swatted at Molokai with the other. Molokai swatted back at Twig with grubby fists, then passed him a bottle of wine. Twig sucked at the bottle. Wine ran down his chin, and they giggled wildly as the van swerved across the center line. Nothing crawled into the back of the van. The ceiling and walls were decorated with more stickers and decals and magic marker graffiti. Overlying it all was a pattern of large dark stains like some kind of cancer. The third occupant of the van, Zilla, lay stretched out on a mattress, where the dark stains were even more profuse. Zilla had an androgynous, perfect face and a ponytail tied back by a purple silk scarf. Wisps of hair escaped the ponytail, framing that astonishing face, those stunning eyes green as limes. "Hello," said Zilla. The voice was soft, a little husky, razor-edged with amusement. Surely Zilla was used to being stared at, used to taking strangers' breath away. "Hello," said Nothing. His voice wasn't working very well. But when he looked up, what he saw was Zilla's mouth, lips parted, the pink tip of a tongue caught between sharp teeth. And then Zilla's hands were on him, drawing him toward that mouth. He wondered whether he might fall in and lie on Zilla's tongue until Zilla swallowed him down. "You are delicious," Zilla told him after they had kissed. "Gross. Gross. Gross. Gross." "So are you," Nothing answered. His heart contracted. He had never felt so far away from home, or so glad to be there. "You're bewitching." "Bewitch me," Nothing managed to say, and then Zilla was sucking at his mouth again. Am I dead? Is this the bad place? "I guess we could take you to Missing Mile," said Twig, trying to focus on Nothing's face. "We're headed for New Orleans. We're going to see our friend there." Nothing clung to the edge, teetering happily. He was laboring under the influence of more drugs than he'd ever had all at once before. He wasn't exactly drunk, and he wasn't exactly high. He simply floated. Screwed up, Jack would have said. In that other world, in that other life. Just plain old screwed up. Then his stomach convulsed, and he fumbled at the door handle. Molokai said, "Just puke on the floor." Ew. But Nothing fell out of the van and rolled over the crackling dead tobacco leaves and vomited copiously on the frosty earth. Back in the van, Nothing expected howls of derision. In this crowd, throwing up surely meant you were a baby. But Molokai and Twig didn't laugh at him. They were snuggled down on the mattress, clutching each other like children. Nothing lit a lucky but wrinkled his nose and pitched the cigarette out the window after 2 drags. "Still sick?" said Molokai. "I bet we can make you better." A glance passed between the 3 of them. Molokai dug under the mattress and pulled out a wine bottle half full of dark liquid, ruby brown and thicker than wine. The outside of the bottle was covered with dried smears and fingerprints of the liquid. "Drink this. It'll fix you up." "If it doesn't kill you," Twig added, with his quick blade of a smile. Nothing took the bottle, uncapped it, lifted it to his mouth, and sipped. There was some kind of liquor, vodka or gin, something oily and stinging. But mingled with that was another taste, dark and sweet and a little decayed, familiar. He brought the bottle down, blinked, then lifted it again and drank deep. Molokai, Twig, and Zilla watched him. All 3 sat very still, seeming to hold their breath. Nothing stopped drinking, licked his lips, and smiled. "I don't think drinking blood is so weird," he said. They passed it around, drinking until the insides of their mouths were stained rotten red. Nothing no longer felt sick. He was giddy with joy. And when Zilla grabbed him again, he kissed back hard. Then he didn't know where the blood had come from, whether it was something they used to scare outsiders or a taste they genuinely cultivated, and right now he didn't care. Anyone who wanted to play vampire was all right by him. The birth of morning found them all heaped on the mattress, tangled, hair across faces, hearts to backbones, hands clutching hands. Zilla stirred and muttered as the first light touched his eyelids, the last ancestral vestige of a reflex he scarcely remembered, even in his nightmares. He pressed his mouth against Nothing's throat, then he came half awake, and, remembering that he had decided to keep this boy, did not bite, but had to suck like a baby before he could sleep. Chapter 16. Steve had awakened with a hellacious hangover. Chapter 17. Around lunchtime, Zilla passed out tiny squares of paper. Blotter, he said. Crucifix from New York. Molokai and Twig gulped theirs down. Nothing looked thoughtfully at his. He had only taken acid twice. Weak stuff called yin/yang. Bought off Jack for $3 a hit. Then he shrugged. The tempo of his days would be different from now on. He might as well enjoy what came with them. He touched the square of paper to his tongue and let it dissolve there. Soon afterward, they stopped at a Waffle House. Molokai wanted pie, and Twig requested a burger cooked very rare, but Zilla ordered only a glass of water, and Nothing did not dare eat anything. Already he could feel the acid beginning to tickle inside him. Nothing's gaze dropped to the table. At some point the others had gotten their food and devoured it. The remains of their meal lay there mangled. Bits of Twig's hamburger, fragments of meat and onion stuck to bread stained pink. The ruins of Molokai's pie, smears of strawberry bleeding into smudges of whipped cream, gory as a roadkill. In the midst of the carnage rose Zilla's glass, immaculate, free from fingerprints, half full of cold, clear water. Molokai put his fingers into the pie and licked them. He smiled across the table at Nothing. His eyes seemed all pupil, black-ringed and enormous, hectically shiny. There was red goo in the spaces between Molokai's teeth, pie filling. It reminded Nothing of the bottles hidden under the mattress in the back of the van, still half full. That taste rose again in his mouth. Sharing their weird blood cocktail somehow made him feel closer to them than any drug or kinky sex act could. It made him more a part of their psychedelic nighttime world. A moment ago, he'd been getting tied up in mind knots, half afraid of his new friends. His friends who were more exciting than anyone he had known before. Their company more intoxicating because somehow they were like him. They accepted him. This was what he had wished for on nights alone in his room, rubbing the ash of incense between his fingers, drifting among the stars on the ceiling, bleeding from the wrist or from somewhere deep inside. What was there to be afraid of? They got back in the van, cranked the music up again, and drove. Later in the evening, they took another round of crucifix, and sometime after midnight, Nothing was just coming into the thick of his trip. He lay curled up on the mattress, his hands pressed to his eyes, watching the brilliant checkered patterns that swirled in the darkness behind his eyelids. His insides shifted. He thought he felt the ends of his intestines twitching. His mind plummeted, raced, soared. He wanted to raise his head and talk to Zilla, but just then a new design swirled up from the depths of blindness, all black and silver and crimson, and he could only lie there and watch it. Cool, said Molokai happily. Twig snorted. There's no room for another hitchhiker. Anyway, we've already got one. I want that one too, said Molokai, enraptured. His hair was full of flowers. We don't know quite what we've got, do we? Zilla mused. This would be a good chance to find out. If not, then more for us. Lane? Said Nothing. Oh my God, breathed the boy. And then they were hugging each other fiercely. Nothing was brushing Lane's hair from his eyes, forgetting how Lane had annoyed him, how he had risen above the futility of his friends' lives, how he had felt such scorn for their complacent desperation. I found you, Lane said. I can't believe I found you. I knew I would. What happened to you? I left the day after you did. When we dropped you off at the bus station, I realized you were the only thing in my life that wasn't bullshit. You were the only one in that whole crowd I ever cared about. I had to get out of there, too. I didn't know if I'd ever find you, but I had to try. Lane kissed him again, timidly touching Nothing's lips with the wet tip of his tongue. Nothing looked up. The other three were watching him avidly. He's my friend, Nothing managed to say. From back home. How nice, said Zilla. His voice was like a bonbon of creamy white chocolate filled with some green corrosive poison. In an instant, he made the choice that would fashion the rest of his life. Hating himself, but feeling something dark and fathomless begin to open within him, he slid out of Lane's embrace and pushed him away. Nothing. What's going on? Lane stared around at the circle of eyes, Molochai's and Twig's tripped out and hungry, Zilla's still spitting green fire. He tried to crawl back across the mattress to nothing, but Zilla hooked a finger through the string of beads around Lane's neck and pulled back hard. Lane made a low, choking sound as the beads tightened across his throat. Lane's eyes, terrified but still trusting, found nothings. Make them stop, he pleaded. Don't let them hurt me. Zilla grabbed Lane's kicking feet and forced them to the mattress with one hand. Lane bucked on the mattress. His eyes never left Nothing's. They had an accusing look now, and Nothing felt a flash of anger. I didn't ask you to follow me, he thought. I didn't tell them to hurt you. He looked sweet, said Molokai. You'll share, won't you? You can use this if you like. Zilla held up a little pearl-handled straight razor, a lethal-looking thing he had produced from his pocket or some fold of the mattress. But you really should do it with your teeth. That's the best way, the most intimate. Then, with a clarity that nauseated him, he realized just what Zilla was talking about. It all came together then, with no jagged edges and no loose threads. This was not an affectation. This was their life. For the blood was the life. They were vampires. The cynical thought that they might be just a bunch of blood-drinking psychopaths never crossed Nothing's mind. He had always believed implicitly in things supernatural, things beyond the ken of the world he woke to every day. He believed in them because they had to be there. Otherwise, there was no hope for him, because he had always known he could not live his whole life in the real world. He had had faith that someday he would find them, or they would find him. And now they had. They had seemed to recognize him from the first, and was that not sign enough? That was when he realized that he could do it. He could tear Lane's pulse open and drink from it. Not because Zilla wanted him to, not even that, but because he wanted to. Somewhere in his mind was the knowledge that they would probably kill him along with Lane if he refused, but that hardly mattered anymore. The fresh blood had given him a hunger of his own. Please, Lane sobbed, and some dim part of Nothing, some part untouched by acid or the night, realized what he was about to do. Lane had been his friend in another life. Nothing twisted to look at Zilla. Zilla smiled a dark smile and said, "Come and be one of us." And Nothing knew he was being told to make his choice. Come and be one of us, or suffer the consequences of your refusal. Die, or be alone, and never drink from the bottle of life again, for the blood was the life. So he opened his mouth as wide as it would go and bit into the soft flesh of Lane's throat. The torrent of blood washed over Nothing's face and bubbled into his mouth. It was as different from his previous small tastes as whiskey from water. This was the taste of life, its very essence. Nothing held Lane close and drank his life, lost in the slowing pulse and the taste of blood and salt. He never realized that most of the tears he tasted were his own. Chapter 18. Sometime in the dull gray afternoon, somnolent and wary of silence, Ghost put down the map he was drawing with crayons and said, "I'm going to bike to town. I want some wine." Do we need, is this going to go somewhere? At the corner where Burnt Church Road met the highway, a tall figure sat hunched behind a sign that said roses. Ghost tried to ride past without seeming to notice the flower seller, but as he drew close, the figure got to its feet and spread its arms wide, wider, immensely wide, stretching. The sleeves of its long, dark cloak billowed. Ghost slowed his bike. Everything in him screamed danger, but he had never been one for turning away from things that scared him, or running from them. He would talk to this person, try to figure out what the sick feeling and the worry were about. That's pretty fucking stupid, dude. That's such a guy. My God, what a man thing to do. Roses, asked the flower seller, or a jack-o'-lantern to light your path. I have no patience for this chapter. I don't have any money, he said, or I'd buy a pumpkin, but you ought to pack up for tonight. It's too cold to sit out here. Even as he spoke, a night wind seemed to be whipping up, carrying the russet smell of autumn in from the fields. For pity, you may have a rose, and I was just packing up. The figure stepped closer and tucked a deep red bud into the lapel of Ghost's army jacket. When one of those long, thin hands brushed the bare triangle of skin at the base of his throat, Ghost shivered. All at once he caught a rush of images, not words, but feelings. The first thing he sensed was age and dark wisdom beyond his ability to measure. He knew this was no man. The second was a terrible, resigned loneliness, a longing for someone he thought might never come. The flower seller's mind was like a sentient void, too empty even to be sad, colder than the night. Without thinking, Ghost said, "You'll be warm when your friends get here." The pale face snapped up. "What friends? Have you news of Zillah?" Ghost stumbled backward. "No, I only know somebody's coming. Somebody must be coming to pick you up, or I guess maybe you live around here." He shut his mouth before his words could get any more tangled. But the eagerness glittering in those eyes put a stupid panic into Ghost. Panic like a moth beating itself against a window. Panic that made him want to hide anything he might know. Hide his own head. This is the bad times coming, he realized. The start of it, anyway. I'm sorry, Ghost said wildly. The flower seller leaned across his wooden stand. His eyes met Ghost's, and his tongue parted out over his pale lips. The long, thin hands trembled. Then that cold gaze darted toward the moon, and the flower seller drew himself up and knotted his fingers together. "Get away from here," he said. "What?" "Go." Now there was a light of desperation in the deep-set eyes. Hungry desperation, it looked like. "Go now, if you want to live." The last light of day disappeared from the sky. The flower seller's face was partially obscured by the growing dark, making it look pointed, feral. He made a half-despairing, half-starved sound deep in his throat and seemed about to lunge right over the stand. But Ghost was already straddling his bike, shoving at the kickstand, reaching up with one hand to steady his hat and pedaling as hard as he could. After a few minutes, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder, but the flower stand and the lone figure, if there, were hidden in shadow. Back in the house, Steve stopped playing and smacked his forehead. "I forgot. Some mail came for you. Our first fan letter, I guess." Steve dug through the clutter on the floor and found a postcard, creased and dog-eared, its colors muted with the grime of small-town post offices. Ghost read it. "You don't know me, but Dylan Thomas drank 18 straight whiskeys on November 9th, 1953, and I am drinking one for you." He looked up at Steve. It signed nothing. "What's it about?" "Who knows? Why don't you hold it to your forehead and find out? Go on, tell me to screw myself." "Suck my aura," said Ghost, and swigged the last sweet drops of his wine. Chapter 19. "Wake up," said a loud voice that seemed to reverberate from the center of Nothing's brain. "We're here." Nothing opened and shut his eyes several times. "I wasn't asleep," he said. "How could I sleep?" Zillah had placed another hit of crucifix on his tongue sometime between midnight and dawn, and since then Nothing had not known where he was or who he was with, or why he had ever bothered to wonder. He had dreamed of standing in front of a culvert somewhere, a dank concrete pipe choked with weeds, kudzu, highway trash. It was dark, soul dark in this hour long past midnight, and far from dawn, but Nothing could see. He could see clearly in the dark, the acid or some new vision refining itself. Slung over his shoulder he held a limp little bundle, a bundle of stained rags and skin gone paler than before. "Put it in there," Zillah had said, and Nothing stuffed the bundle deep back into the culvert. Looking back, he caught a last glimpse of feathery white blonde hair straggling from a blue bandana. Wet threads of scarlet ran through that hair, and for a moment Nothing stopped, struck by the enormity of what had happened, of what you did, his mind amended. "They really are vampires," he thought. "You've consigned yourself to a life of blood and murder. You can never rejoin the daytime world." And he answered himself, "Fine, as long as I don't have to be alone again." "We're here," Molokai said, dropping Nothing back onto the mattress. "This is it, right, Twig?" "Yup," said Twig. 14 Burnt Church Road, missing mile, N. Cree, curb service, kiddo. Oh, NC. Zillah came slowly and luxuriously awake. He opened first one brilliant eye, then the other, ran his hand through his silky hair, yawned and stretched his cat-like body. When his eyes lit upon Nothing's, he sat up and took Nothing into his arms and kissed him. Nothing still wanted to talk to lost souls. He had come all this way, but he no longer ached for a family. He no longer wanted to pretend that Steve and Ghost were his long-lost brothers. He had his family now. He had chosen them in their nighttime world. "Come on," he said. "You're all going in with me." He had asserted himself for the first time. He was becoming their equal, and he thought he saw approval in the slant of Zillah's smile. He felt so good, so strong and confident, that he never stopped to think what might happen once they got into the house. The door sported an incongruously fancied knocker, the face of a gargoyle wrought in silver. with a heavy ring through its nostrils and eyes that seemed about to bulge out of their sockets. Nothing used the ring to knock, first gently and then loudly, but no one stirred inside the house. Malachi had been peering through the window next to the front door. Now he gave it a shove. It slid up with only a small groaning protest. "I found a way in," Malachi said proudly. And before Nothing quite knew what was happening, the other three had climbed through the window. Then he realized what the others were doing. Malachi and Twig were in the kitchen, ransacking the refrigerator. He heard pop-tops cracking open as they helped themselves to cans of beer. Zilla fell dramatically onto the couch and began unbuttoning his shirt with dreamy fascination, his long hair draped over the arm of the couch, streaming down. The passage down the hall, pale and wavering and tantalizing, held Nothing's attention for a long time before he noticed the smell. The dark metallic smell of blood, and beneath that the bittersweet scent of rose petals. At the end of that hall, drowning in that scent, might be Ghost, and Nothing thought that somehow the smell might be his fault. He should not have brought his new family here. He lived in a different world now, and could not cross back and forth. He started down that white passage. Then he was at the door of someone's bedroom. Ghosts, it had to be. Delicate colored leaves and dead flowers were pinned to the ceiling. On the walls, in crayon and ink, pencil and magic marker, was a fabulous twisted riot of color. Maps of real lands, maps of strange lands, faces that seemed about to speak. And words, hundreds of words. "My God, I'm home," thought Nothing, and stepped into the room. And in that instant, the figure on the bed, the figure that Nothing had not seen because it lay so still, swathed in a great heap of bedclothes because its pale hair fell so transparent across the pillow, sat bolt upright and shrieked, "Nothing!" Ghost shrieked from the next room, his voice clear and terrified. Nothing, it sounded like he'd said. Nightmares for everybody this morning, or this afternoon, more likely. What time had they finally gone to bed? No idea. He rolled out of bed, dragged on semi-clean underwear and a t-shirt that didn't even reproach a state of cleanliness. That was when he heard the voices in the living room and the footsteps coming down the hall. Having his privacy or his belongings invaded anywhere at any time was enough to make Steve mad. He had never expected anything bad to happen in this house. Had vaguely thought it was... Oh my God. Just get to it already. He grabbed the bat, hefted it, and stepped out into the hall. Right into the path of Zilla. "Who the F are you?" He had time to get out. And then the crazy green-eyed apparition was lunging at him, all barred teeth and hooked claw hands. So Steve pulled the slugger back and swung it straight into the effer's face. The crunch of bone and cartilage reverberated through the wood into Steve's hands. It wasn't a bad feeling. Green eyes staggered back and hit the wall hard, but didn't go down even with the fountain of blood pouring between his cupped hands. His mouth and nose were erupting blood. Steve had felt the bat take several teeth out. Two taller, bulkier figures were coming down the hall. Steve was afraid somebody might be in Ghost's room, too. He had to get in there first. He grabbed the bleeding figure by its long hair and one shoulder, and with all his strength shoved it down the hall toward the approaching strangers. It crashed into them, spraying blood, and all three staggered and nearly went down. Steve ran into Ghost's room, slammed the door behind him, and locked it. Steve's adrenaline rose another notch at the sight of the strange kid bending over Ghost's bed, but he couldn't bring himself to bash the kid's skull in, not from behind. Instead, he grabbed the kid by the back of his coat and threw him across the room. He did not know that he was screaming Ghost's name, but later his throat would be sore. He turned, weighing the bat in both hands, keeping it between him and the kid, keeping himself between the kid and the bed. "What did he do to you?" he asked Ghost, who was looking dazed, not quite awake. "I didn't do anything," the kid said. "I wouldn't hurt him, honest. Or you either, Steve. How do you know my name? I like your music and..." "Yeah? This how you usually show your appreciation for art? Breaking into people's houses?" Ghost blinked and rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the last shreds of nightmare. Steve edged closer to the kid, who was still sprawled on the floor, staring miserably up at him. He had enormous street orphan eyes and that phony dyed black hair that so many kids wore and Steve hated. "What's your name?" the kid. "Nothing. Nothing?" said Ghost. "Did you send a..." Something crashed against the door. It shuddered in its frame. Another crash, and the door swung halfway open. From the corner of his eye, Steve saw Ghost scrambling up in bed, pressing his back against the headboard. The two larger figures appeared in the doorway, supporting the smaller one between them. The entire lower half of the small one's face was a mask of bruise and blood. His hands dangled at his sides, bloodied, the fingers clenching and unclenching. When he opened his mouth to speak, Steve saw with grim satisfaction that he had taken out most of the bastard's front teeth. Steve jerked his arm tight across the kid's throat. He saw the light-colored roots of the kid's hair and the tender scalp beneath, and knew that he could bring the sluggard down on it if he had to. Green eyes stared at him for a moment, considering. "Let him go," he said. "If you do, we'll just settle our score with you. But if I have to take him away from you, I'll rip open your pretty friend and have his intestines for breakfast." "Yeah, effer. I'm real eager to make plans with a bag of pus like you." Steve throttled the kid a little harder and heard him choke, though he had not struggled or cried out. "Not effer," said Green Eyes. "Zilla. Remember the name. Remember it when you feel my teeth sink into your heart." "Well, if you're going to sink 'em into my heart, you better go pick 'em out of the hall runner first." Steve thought he felt the kid stifle a helpless laugh of all things. He eased up on the boy's throat a little. Steve knew his shaky bargaining chip was gone. He thrust Nothing as far away from him as he could and started swinging the bat as Molokai and Twig closed in. Sharp nails raked across his chest, drawing beads of blood. Sharper teeth sank deep into the meat of his hand, and he screamed and lost his grip on the bat. "Don't do him just yet," said Zilla mildly, and the teeth went away. One creep had Steve pinned on the bed, sitting on his chest and trapping his arms. Molokai and Twig were heavy and bulky and amazingly strong, and Steve couldn't catch his breath with the full weight of whichever one it was on top of him. Ghost hadn't even had time to struggle before the other creep had pinned him. Steve aimed a useless kick at Zilla, who stepped gracefully away. Nothing pushed himself away from the wall, flung his arms out in a pleading gesture. "Don't hurt them." Zilla snorted and hawked a bright pink gob of blood to the floor. "Why not?" he said, dangerously quiet. "Because they know me. Ghost knows who I am. He said so." "Yes." Zilla's smashed face convulsed in what might have been a smile. "I know who you are, too. You're a pretty little boy who hasn't learned his place yet. You're a pest who is going to have his throat ripped out in about 2 minutes if he doesn't shut the F up." Zilla rounded on Nothing, jabbed him hard in the stomach with the baseball bat. The boy staggered backward, the wind knocked out of him. "No!" A black blur was in the air, raincoat billowing like great wings, arrowing straight across the bed and slamming into Zilla. Nothing's momentum carried him and Zilla straight into the opposite wall. Zilla took most of the impact. Nothing crouched astride Zilla, still gasping for breath. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "You made me kill Lane and I did it, but not Ghost, not Ghost." Nothing's teeth clacked together when Twig hauled him up, and he tasted blood again. He reached up, grasped Twig's hands, and removed them from the lapels of his coat. "You want to waste time screwing with me?" he asked. "Zilla didn't tell you to screw with me, and he's hurt bad." "Because of you," Twig growled. Nothing could feel Twig's hands trembling in his grasp, aching to go for his throat. He knew Twig could kill him in a heartbeat. "Then save me for him. Let him punish me for getting him hurt. He'll be mad if he comes around, and you've already sucked me dry, won't he?" Now Nothing was sure Twig wanted to rip his throat open. Molokai would do it if Twig did. They would kill him and then tear into Steve and Ghost. Nothing met Twig's eyes and held them. Twig was wilder and meaner. Oh yes, Twig was the badass here. But Nothing was smarter. "Zilla's lying there bleeding," he said. "If you won't help me, I'll carry him out myself, but he'll know what happens." He jerked away from Twig intense, ready to fight if Twig lunged at him. Twig's eyes blazed feral light. Nothing blazed right back at him, and Twig's eyes dropped. "You help me carry him," Nothing told Molokai. Then he glanced back at Twig. "You go on out and start the van." Twig's eyes flared again, and for a moment Steve thought the kid had pushed it too far. But Twig just exhaled noisily. Steve smelled rotten blood and left the room. Nothing and Molokai got Zilla's arms around their necks and helped him up. Nothing looked at Steve with wide brimming eyes, trying to smile. Sadness and pride warred in his face. "I didn't let them hurt you," he said. "Now maybe you'll believe me. I never meant for any of this to happen." Now that the fight was ebbing out of him, Steve felt weaker by the minute. "I just want you out of here," he said. "All of you." He hadn't meant to cause all this pain. How could he have known what would happen? No one had told him much of anything yet. They had taught him how to rip through resisting flesh, how to coax the last drop of blood from a limp, cold body that had once been warm and alive. But no one had sat him down and told him how quickly and inexorably the other world, the day world he supposed, would begin to slip away. Zillah hadn't said to him, "We are your whole world now, we and others of our kind. We are the only friends you can have now." Or as Molokai and Twig might have put it, everybody else is just cocktails. He glanced back at Ghost one last time. He wished he could crawl into bed with Ghost, pull the pile of patchwork quilts and scruffy blankets around him, and sleep in Ghost's arms. But Ghost did not want him, and why think such thoughts anyway? He had made his choice. Not even a choice, really. He had simply gone home. Steve slammed the front door. 3 shadows, one large and unkempt, 2 small and slim and bowed, slid across the window. Then they were gone. He went back to Ghost's room. Ghost was lying flat on his back, looking at the stars on the ceiling. His hands lay limp on the blanket. Steve sat on the edge of the bed. "Crap," he said. "We still have a show to do tonight." "They'll be there," Ghost told him with absolute certainty. Chapter 20. Almost halfway. Chapter 20 is a frustrating chapter to cover because, one, it's the largest chapter in the novel. I was reading ebook, so ebook pages is like around 100 pages. That's a lot of pages. Mostly they're from like 20 to like 40. Nothing goes as long as this one. Okay. Problem 2 is that every character gets a point of view. And most importantly, problem 3, not very much happens. There's no tension. It's just boring. I've decided, instead of just like reading the story and cutting it up like I have been, that I'm just going to tell you what happens, because ultimately it's like 2 things. All right. Everybody's at the Sacred U. Ghost and Steve are on the stage playing as lost souls. Nothing, Zillah, Twig, and Molokai are in the crowd watching. Christian is bartending, and Anne is also there. She's watching the show. Ghost and Steve have a great time. They're having a lot of fun. Zillah's having the time of his life seeing this band that he's been in love with for like a week. They finish playing. Steve goes to the bar. He gets wasted. He sees Anne. They talk. They exchange like 3 pleasant sentences until he says something really cruel and crappy. It upsets Anne. She runs away. She goes crying. She goes to her car and she cries. Steve continues to get wasted. Ghost, Nothing, and Zillah just kind of wander outside for some reason. It's just kind of vague. They're just like, everybody's all moody and weird. So they go outside. Zillah sees Anne. He hits on her. They end up going back to his van, and they knock some boots. Nothing and Ghost are just like outside. Nothing's crying because his boyfriend is hooking up with someone else. Zillah and Anne finish. Gross. And afterwards she's like, "Zillah, I'm in love with you." And Zillah's like, "Get away from me." And he literally like pushes her away, and she falls over, and she's like in shock over the whole thing. Zillah's magic dong, whatever. While this was happening, Molokai, Twig, and Christian see each other. They're like, "Oh my god, it's Chrissy, yay, it's Chrissy's here." And then the 3 of them go to the van. So now everybody, including Steve, who crawled his way out of the bar slobbering and like a crazed animal, feral animal on all 4s, skitters over there. Everyone's at this van, right? Christian sees Nothing. He's like, "Hey, I know that name. You're the baby in the basket. The little Moses I left in the weeds." And Nothing's like, "Oh my god, you're the one who left me in the basket. I'm so happy that I finally got to meet you." And then Christian's like, "Yeah, Nothing. Jesse's baby. Jesse, the girl, the baby, you know, Zillah, you know, the girl. That's your kid."
Pause for this reaction.
Why, you're Zilla's son, said Christian. He had assumed they knew, but there was a silence. Absolute silence. Even Malachi and Twig were quiet. Oh, and one last thing. Anne is now pregnant and is described in a very disgusting, needy way. End of part 1. But even ghosts couldn't be there all the time. Steve is insufferable. This is a gosh darn pain in the butt, said Zilla. Part 2, Chapter 21. Night. Heavy green night. Pine branches bending low to sweep the gravel road, the dying grass, the trash in the ditches. Sneaky night, riotous with last October kudzu. The kudzu would be dead in another month, like a dry brown blanket thrown over the trees and the roadsides. But now it still writhed under the moon, succulent, shifting, green night, violin road. A trailer up on cinder blocks, a silver Bel Air, and a sagging black van, parked in the scrubby dirt yard. Behind the trailer, a tangled thicket of rose bushes that would bear great lacy blossoms on into December. The roses had gone wild. Nothing knew that if he turned his head, he would be able to look through the bedroom window and see the spiny etchwork of the rose bushes against the night sky. But he didn't really want to turn his head. Instead, he lay very still, stretched out flat on his back in Christian's bed. His hands moved through Christian's glittering black hair, stroked the long curve of Christian's back. He knew Christian was being careful. He knew Christian wouldn't hurt him, would take only a taste of his blood. This was not feeding, this was lovemaking. At last, Christian's mouth unfastened from Nothing's throat, and blood flowed between them, trickling over Nothing's chest, staining the sheets a little more. Nothing realized he had been holding his breath. He let it out in a great rush. What had he been afraid of? Christian wouldn't hurt him. He was of Christian's kind. Still, he hadn't wanted to turn his head. Nothing, moaned Christian, a breath of fading ecstasy, born on the scent of blood. Oh, Nothing, I would like to rip your throat open. Thank you, said Nothing. He knew this was a compliment. Then after a moment, tell me about Jessie again. Christian sighed. She looked like you. The same great dark eyes, the same pointed chin, the same listening silence. You screwed her. A pause, then, yes, many times over a hot New Orleans summer. She was 16, Nothing said thoughtfully. Something like that. A year older than me. Yes. How old were you? A pause. 368. Christian stroked Nothing's head. I can see the true color of your hair at the roots. Golden brown. It was that color when you were a baby. I need a dye job. Absently, he twirled a piece of his hair, put it in his mouth. Then he took a deep breath and asked, What's it like to live such a long time? Christian stepped into a pair of impossibly long black trousers, buttoned a black shirt up to his chin. He turned to go. At the bedroom door, he paused. Christian, said Nothing. I would not wish it upon anyone, Christian told him. Nothing tried to imagine that summer in the French Quarter, the endless sweltering days above the bar, Christian's long, bony hands moving over Jessie's slick breasts, her distended belly, her belly that cradled him, unborn. He wished he could be Christian's hands. He wished he could feel Jessie's weight above him, her skin thick as if with oil. And there, in the womb, half-formed, had something in him known even then whose child he was, had something in him wanted his father. Was that why he had spent the first 15 years of his life alone, always searching for a place he might belong, for a perfect love? Well, he had it now. Body and soul and all the realm between. Father, Nothing thought. But he could not disgust himself. He could not make himself ashamed. He knew these were things he was supposed to feel, things the rational daylight world would expect him to feel, but he could not force himself to feel them. Its morals had never been his. Its baubles of status had never hypnotized him with their false glitter. Were members of his race born with some sort of immoral instinct that shielded them from the guilt of killing to stay alive? If he had not been born with such an instinct, could he have taken that first bite out of Lane's throat? His bond to Zilla was also his bond to this world of blood and night. He knew that now Zilla would not leave him, would not abandon him. He had faced Zilla down once, and he could do it again. In a weird way, it seemed to make Zilla proud of him. Nothing was of Zilla's blood, and nothing would not let him go now, not in 1,000 years. They might live that long, might live 1,000 years or more, and still they would be together. He would ride the highways with Molokai, Twig, Zilla, and now Christian, forever. They would drink and make wild love and never grow old, and he would never have to be alone. That's a nightmare. God, to be around those guys all of the time, constantly, the rest of your life does not sound like home. It sounds like I want to leave. I'm tired. Come here, said nothing. Zilla came to him and slipped under the cold sheets with him. As Zilla's arms tightened around him, nothing heard himself say, Daddy. I want to die. Zilla kissed his eyes, his forehead, his lips. Yes, that's lovely. Call me that. I want to die. Kill me. Daddy, nothing whispered as Zilla unwound the sheets, kissed his throat, his chest, the tender concave stretch of skin below his ribs. My baby, said Zilla, and bit him gently. Puppy. Puppy. Why did you write this? Chapter 22. I don't think there's anything to this chapter. It's just nothing shows up. And then he's like, hey guys, we're probably going to leave. I just wanted to tell you that. Yeah, chapter 23 is when Nothing tells Ghost and Steve that the vamps are all leaving and going to New Orleans. And then Anne, everybody figures Anne is going to follow them. And then everybody just decides to go to New Orleans. And that's the chapter. And I don't care enough to read it. Right, and everybody learns that Anne's pregnant. Chapter 23. She's going to what? Said Molokai when Christian told them. Again, said Twig. What would we do with a baby? We could eat it, Molokai offered. Zilla grimaced. Eat my baby? Are you mad? After a moment's reflection, he added, Nothing and I might eat it, but you couldn't have any. Zilla, please. Not one drop, not one pink sugar drop. For a moment, Christian almost disliked them. Not Nothing, but the other three. He hated their insouciance, their cheerful cruelty. They didn't care about the girl. Their time in Missing Mile was done. They would go on to New Orleans and carry on their never-ending party without a backward glance. It did not matter to them that another girl's belly would swell with a malignant child, a child that would eventually rip her open and bleed her dry. As he was cutting the last rose, a great frothy pink-orange thing whose veined petals curled delicately into red at the edges, the girl Anne came up behind him and touched his sleeve. When she told him, Christian's heart sank. Had Zilla grown up not at all in 15 years? Had he never heard of condoms? I'll have a beautiful baby, she said, with green eyes. It will kill you, he told her. They'll leave you and you'll be alone and it will kill you. He turned to face her, the huge rose in one hand, a rusty pair of scissors in the other. Listen to me. You have to get rid of it. You must. Why? He could tell her the truth, but if she knew what danger she was in, she might tell someone else. She might convince someone, and that would endanger Nothing, would endanger Zilla and the others. You must get rid of it because he will leave you, Christian said lamely. You'll be alone. I'll follow them wherever they go, Anne said. I'll follow Zilla. They'll go to New Orleans, he told her, to the French Quarter. There, it was done. She might follow them. She might find them. She might not. Christian turned away towards the trailer. He did not look back at the girl who stood by the rose bushes, the girl with funeral black lace tied in her bright hair, the girl who, even though there was no physical resemblance, none at all, reminded him so strongly of Jessie 15 years ago. The same bewitched light shone in her eyes. Chapter 24. I don't feel bad for Ghost for having such big feelings that he feels sad when other people feel sad. What does he do? What has he done? Has he helped anyone? Has he hurt anyone? No, he's just a boring, neutral stance, and it continues to be a boring, neutral stance. As he drove past the graveyard, I was covered in fern. I'm so itchy. I'm so itchy. So, I don't think we're ever gonna pass the Bechdel test in this novel. Chapter 26. They asked at several hotels and guest houses, starting with the modest ones and progressing to the seedy-looking dumps. There was nothing under $50 a night, which would take just about all the cash they had. "Let's just stay up all night drinking," Steve suggested. Ghost was almost ready to agree with him when he saw a small wooden sign at the mouth of an alley, "Magic Shop." Below that, in smaller letters, "Arcady Raventon, Proprietor." Ghost made out a figure standing behind a long glass counter, a small, emaciated figure draped in white. The proprietor. Ghost saw sharp, jutting cheekbones and hollow eyes, thin, dark hair, spidery hands resting flat on the glass, bony fingers splayed. "We just got into town," said Ghost. "We're looking for a place to stay a few days." "I am Arcady Raventon," said the proprietor. Ghost could see his face more clearly now, but could discern no hint of age. The skin was smooth, the eyes depthless dark pools. He took the hand Arcady offered, a hand whose bones would surely crumble if Ghost squeezed too hard, a hand with bones like the bones of lizards. In a torrent of dust, Arcady swept aside a heavy velvet curtain and led them up a narrow dark staircase. At the top of the stairs was a cozy suite of rooms with clean white walls, large windows that let in dazzling sunshine, hardwood floors gleaming golden. Arcady showed them the rooms one after another. "That one is mine, the small one belongs to two of my brother's friends, and this," indicating it with a grand sweep of his arm, "is the room where you may stay, if you so wish. I would not think of turning Miss Deliverance's grandson away from my door." The room was simple, a clean mattress, a window high up on the rear wall, a square room, 4 walls of equal length, 4 sensible walls to contain Ghost's thoughts, to keep out green-eyed wraiths and voices that might invade his mind at night. "You said you brought yourself back from the dead," Ghost reminded Arcady as they finished ascending the stairs. Behind him, Ghost heard Steve mutter something, but he ignored it. Arcady's dry, faintly foreign voice brought him back to attention. It was cold in Paris that winter, as cold as the moon, as cold as loneliness, as cold as the kiss that killed me. The kiss. Steve's voice was heavy with cynicism. "Well, perhaps a bit more than just the kiss, but you must allow me my bit of romance." Sarcasm sharpened Arcady's voice, and Ghost shot Steve a warning look. Steve stared at the altar. "So," Arcady went on, "this, kiss, and the rest of my lover's body as well, was ripe with death, and then the sickness rotted my liver away, and I had caught it too by that time, and I was alone, in Paris, in the winter, I was alone." A faint smile played about Arcady's lips. "Have I mentioned my brother Ashley? No? Ashley was my youngest brother, the beauty of the Raventons." Arcady laughed, a sound like wind among chips of crystal. "When I went to Paris, he stayed here, and I vowed that I would come back." Arcady's fingers strayed to the altar, toyed with the dark velvet drop-cloth. "So before I died, I prepared. I had just enough time to find the things I needed. I sent for powders from Haiti, for potions from Guatemala. I procured the blood of an ancient man in the Rue Alfers, the bones of a child in the catacombs of Montmartre. But at last I could search no longer. The sickness came and smiled its final soft dark smile at me, and my blood dried in my veins and my eyeballs shriveled. One morning before dawn I swallowed the concoction I had made, and I let the sickness take me. There was one instant in which I thought, my God, now I am dead. And then I was. And I awoke in the morgue of a Paris hospital, and when I stretched myself and smiled, one of the morgue attendants suffered a heart attack. Fortunately, it was not fatal. Then I made my way home to New Orleans to keep my vow to Ashley. But, as any sad story should end, Ashley too had died, and had not come back. He would never be my apprentice. He would learn none of my secrets. Ghost licked his lips nervously. His tongue was as dry as Arcady's must have been all through that long winter in Paris. "What happened to Ashley?" he asked. Arcady knelt and flipped up the velvet drop-cloth. His hands disappeared into the blackness beneath the altar. Shadows lapped at his knuckles, his wrists, then he withdrew his hands. Steve cursed and took a step backward. Ghost's eyes widened. Arcady was holding a perfect human skull, smooth and narrow, bleached to the golden white of old ivory. "Ghost and Stephen," Arcady said, "meet my brother Ashley." Never mind how Arcady Raventon's eyes melted when Ghost reached out his hands and said, "Can I hold him?" Arcady put the skull into Ghost's hands. Ghost cradled it carefully. Then 2 familiar faces rose up before him, 2 pairs of silvery eyes, a tangle of scarlet and yellow hair. They were smiling at Ghost as they had the last time he'd seen them, sitting astride the branch of the old oak in the clearing on that first night of strangeness. But this time their ripe mouths were smeared with blood and other juices, with shreds of tissue. Ghost felt sick. A stupid panic welled up in his throat. But he put the skull back in Arcady's hands and said only, "Your brother was very handsome, wasn't he?" He ran his finger around the edge of one of the empty eye sockets. Those eyes, how they could slay me. But he died. Yes, I came back home and he had died. My Ashley, my brother, and now I am alone. Wait a second. Ghost's voice was halting. There was no doubt in it, only wonder. You came home. You were there. Why didn't you bring Ashley back from the dead, too? He met Ghost's eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was soft and even. Ashley didn't want to come back, he said. So was it vampires that killed your brother? Ghost asked Arcady a little later. He figured it couldn't hurt to find out just what the twins were. Vampires. Arcady's hand twitched. He almost dropped the bottle of sherry. He crossed himself twice, first upside down, then right side up. Lord, child, why do you want to know about vampires? Jesus, Ghost, Steve muttered. I just wondered, Ghost said lamely. Arcady looked hard at him. Ghost, my child, it is difficult to imagine you just wondering about anything. You are a far more powerful sensitive than I ever could be. You have an eye in your heart, Ghost. An eye that shines, an eye that feels. What the F is he babbling about? Steve asked thickly. His hand was on Ghost's knee now. His fingers brushed skin through a hole in Ghost's sweatpants, and Ghost shivered at that dry touch. But vampires, Ghost. Vampires. They are not to be mentioned lightly. Not as in the cheap novels, the Hollywood legends. You see, Ghost child, the myths are wrong, and that very wrongness makes the creatures all the more dangerous. They are not undead. They have never died. They are a separate race, or races. There are those who suck blood, those who suck souls, those who feed on the pain of others. Some of them can walk among us, free in the sunlight. Some of them are able to live as human beings from day to day, from year to year. Of course, they must move about like nomads, because after a point they do not age. Timidly, Ghost interrupted. How come you know so much about them? I have known vampires of all sorts, said Arcady. On my first visit to Paris, I met a most charming one. A blood drinker. She was elegant, well-mannered, cultured. Most of them are. We were never lovers, Arcady went on, though how badly I wanted her. Rochelle. Violet-eyed, though she always wore dark glasses, even at night, hair as black as 1,000 midnights, as eyeless sockets, with tips dyed white and fuchsia. Rochelle was celibate. She had a terror of becoming pregnant. She insisted that no precautions were reliable enough. Should she conceive, she told me, it would mean the end of her. Our babies are born without teeth, Rochelle told me, but even so they manage to chew their way out. Perhaps they have a set of womb teeth. Perhaps they claw their way out with their tiny fingers, but they kill. Always they kill, just as I ripped my mother apart. I begged her to see one of the back alley surgeons to have the child removed as one would excise a cancer, but she refused. By that time she was half mad with fear. It would know, she insisted. It is too late. It has already started eating me. I can feel it churning inside me, shredding my womb. She tried to cut the child out of her body. I found it in the ruins of her belly, half hidden behind coils of entrails. It was shriveled, bloody, long dead. It was still tiny, as large as a red bean, but I found it because her fingers were cupped around it. She had been trying to pull it out. She did not want to die with it still inside her. You guessed right, Ghost. Ashley's lovers were vampires, a different sort of vampire. They appreciate the taste of blood but do not need it. They feed on willing souls. They come into your dreams and try to find a niche in your brain. But they are real, and if you let them in, they will destroy you as surely as any bloodsucker. These were Ashley's lovers, the lovers who killed him. He stopped, sighed, shook his head. They are beautiful too, he said. They took all of Ashley's beauty, and their own beauty remains. They rejuvenated often, and I cannot tell you why I let them live upstairs. Perhaps I hope that one day I will have my chance for revenge. Perhaps I am simply too afraid of them to refuse them anything. Chapter 27. Nothing pressed his face to the window. Below him lay a narrow alley strewn with broken glass that sparkled in the sunlight, and beyond that stretched a vista of bright streets. Royal, Bourbon, Dimly he remembered names from last night. Magic, talismanic names. Names of streets where anything might happen. He decided not to wake the others. He wanted to explore the strange but somehow familiar maze of streets by himself. A small thrill of anarchy went through him as he tore a page out of his notebook and wrote a message to Zilla. Back by tonight was all it said. In this room Christian had held him all blood-slimed, had given him his name. Now he would go out and discover the streets that were his home. Now he was almost home. Some small rational part of his mind wondered how he was able to walk these streets so easily. But he could not really think it strange. He had dreamed of this city, of roaming these streets. A glittering map of the French Quarter seemed to unfold in his head, half imagined and half remembered, as clear as the burn of chartreuse. He swung around a lamppost, and his coat floated out in an undulating circle of black silk. Not until he was half a block from the room did Nothing notice the man following slowly behind him. The man walked bent slightly at the waist, one arm clamped across his stomach as if it hurt him to move. He was only a shape in the fading light, neither large nor small, featureless. Nothing slowed his steps. The man slowed too. Nothing walked faster. So did the man, doubling up even more. Instead of stopping at the boarded-up bar, Nothing turned right. He would lead the man into the alley that ran beneath Christian's window. The man stopped a few feet away, badly hunched now. His breathing sounded harsh and painful. His face was a wavering pale blotch on the dusk. "Jesse," he whispered. The man came closer. With dry fingertips, he touched Nothing's face. "Jesse," the man said again, more evenly this time. Nothing tried to make his voice calm. It came out husky, as if he'd smoked a whole pack of Luckies that day. "That's not my name," he said. "You are so like her." The old man pulled himself upright. His face contorted. Nothing imagined tissue pulling loose inside him, bleeding bad blood. He gripped the man's arm, trying to give what support he could. The man breathed deeply and was able to continue. "My daughter died many years ago, but you are so very like her." "It's Wallace," Nothing realized wildly. Should he tell Wallace his name, or should he lie? Something in him rebelled at denying his name. It was truly his now, and he would claim it. "My name is Nothing," he said. "Who are you?" The man grabbed Nothing's shoulders and gave him a feeble shake. "Who are you, child?" "My mother's name was Jessie," he said. Doubt flickered in Wallace's eyes, brighter than the pain and weariness. If Nothing wanted Wallace to trust him, he had to think of some kind of proof. At once it came to him. "She disappeared 15 years ago at Mardi Gras," he told Wallace. "That was when she met my father." Not until the words were out, hanging in the cool, still air of the dusk, did Nothing realize his mistake. "Then you are one of the unholy creatures, too," Wallace whispered. "The city has become riddled with them." With a convulsive motion, he tore the crucifix from his neck and thrust it at Nothing, trying to drive him toward the end of the alley. "Repent, while you are still young. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, tear the bloodlust from your heart." Nothing could not bring himself to laugh. He caught Wallace's hand and took the cross away. "I'm sorry, grandfather," he said. "That doesn't work on all of us." "Then it's lucky that the Lord told me to carry other protection," said Wallace. In one jerky movement, he whipped a small pistol from the waistband of his trousers and aimed it at Nothing's forehead. Nothing saw Wallace's finger tightening on the trigger. Actually saw that. Then something was plummeting toward them. Nothing saw the large, dark shape hit Wallace dead on. Saw Wallace's body jerk forward and his arm fly up. The shot went wild. Bricks splintered far overhead. Zilla crouched atop Wallace's prone form. He must have launched himself from the second-story window, but he was not even breathing hard. "Some fine messes you get yourself into," said Zilla. "What if I hadn't seen you from up there? I won't lose you now, Nothing." Zilla rolled Wallace over and began to slap him across the face, over and over, glaring up at Nothing. "Don't you know? Slap. I love you. Slap. I love you. Slap." God, he's such a... He is a character, huh? God. He's supposed to be intimidating, and He grabbed Nothing by the front of his coat, nearly choking him. With his other hand, he cupped Nothing's chin. The gesture was almost tender, except that Zilla dug his long nails into the flesh of Nothing's cheeks. Zilla was hurting him on purpose. Nothing felt a clear, icy fury begin to rise within him. "Get your hands off me," he said. Zilla's eyes flared brighter. "What?" "I said, get them off me." Nothing shoved Zilla's hand away from his face and twisted out of Zilla's grasp. They faced each other in the darkening alley. Nothing's heart beat painfully fast. But he was pleased to realize he wasn't trembling. I'm sorry I get myself into stupid messes, okay? I haven't been doing this very long. I don't know what's right and what's wrong. Nobody except Christian ever tells me anything. With each word, he grew angrier. You don't treat me like your son. You treat me like I'm half sex slave and half lapdog. When I'm good, you pat me on the head, and when I screw up, you yell at me and hurt me. But you never explain anything to me. What kind of a father are you, anyway?
Gross.
Nothing gasped for breath. He could see only 2 bright green spots on the darkness. All I have to say is this, he continued. Don't ever hurt me again. I love you. I want to stay with you. But don't you hurt me. I'm not Molokai or Twig. I won't take it. I'm sick of it. Zilla stared at him. Slowly the blaze in his eyes died down. They became cool, appraising. Wait here, he said. In a few minutes, Zilla came back down with Molokai and Twig. They had left Christian sleeping, they said. They could tell him about Wallace later. It would be a surprise. Nothing suspected, they were just greedy. He crawled forward and knelt beside Wallace. His grandfather's cheek rested on a broken bottle. His eyes were open, still aware, brimming with rage and pain. He choked back a sob and sank in his new-filed teeth. His grandfather's blood was bitter, and he and his family drank every drop. Chapter 28. It might mean Steve was about ready to say, screw this crap, man, and give... I don't care about Steve. Oh my God, I don't care. Is it possible to care less about this man? I don't think so. But Ghost knew guilt could be traced back forever. Blame could be laid every which way, and what good would it do? Whose pain would be lessened by it? Steve had done what he had done, and because he was Steve, he could not have done it any other way. Steve had done what he had done, assaulted his girlfriend. And because he was Steve, he could not have done it any other way, except by assaulting his girlfriend. Duh. That's just how things are. That's just how they are. Do you get why I don't like Ghost? God. Shut up. God. Ghost stared into the dark. Sometimes he thought he was the only person who understood Steve at all. They had been together so long, but what good did that do Steve? First, Arcady made Ghost swallow a tranquilizing powder. Ghost didn't want it, but in the end it was easy to make him swallow it. Arcady just slipped inside Ghost's mind and pushed. Then he made Ghost tell his tale. The whole thing, vampires and all. Why deceive himself? He had wanted to bewitch Ghost and lure him into bed, to drive him pleasure mad, to drown him in a sea of silk sheets and feather pillows. It wasn't as if he meant to seduce the boy, but might they not offer each other a night of creature comfort, a night of companionship? I found him when I returned home from Paris at the end of that long dying winter. We had been living in a church down by Bayou St. John, an abandoned place. Ashley hanged himself in the bell tower. When I cut his body down, I saw why. It was as dry and twisted as a mandrake root. Ashley had been dead 7 days, but nothing in him had rotted except his eyes and his tongue. There was nothing else left to rot. They had sucked all his juices out. He rustled in my arms as I cut the rope, and when I lifted him down and laid him on the floor of the bell tower, he rattled like a sack full of bones. His lovers were still there, living on the top floor of the church, burning incense to mask the faint smell of Ashley's decay. When I descended from the bell tower cradling Ashley's skull, the flesh fell away from it as easily as old crumbling parchment. They were making love on a dirty mattress they had dragged in, biting throats, clutching hands, laughing and sobbing with their pleasure. I sat with Ashley in my arms and waited for them to finish. At last, one of them looked up at me and said, "It was easy for him, Arcady, as easy as breathing." And the other one told me, "Death is easy. You should know that, Arcady. Death is easy." The twins could still lure Arcady into their bed on occasion, because they were beautiful and he was alone. But he hated them for what they had done to Ashley, and he was afraid of the hold they already had upon him, and there was no one else. Not until now, not until this nervous, magical ghost child with the pale blue eyes, the ragged clothes from some fantastic thrift shop, the translucent hair that fell across his eyes as he slept. She'll die, Ghost. Unless that fetus comes out soon, its growth will be too far gone. No, you must poison it. Otherwise it will grow, and Anne will die. And perhaps your precious Steve will die too. Guilt twists a man, Ghost. You cannot protect him forever. Death can come in a bottle, Ghost. And I think Steve has already opened that bottle and taken the first swallow. You must poison it, Ghost, to save Anne. To save Steve. Arcady paused, then delivered the bitter coup de grace. I know the recipe. I developed it after Rochelle died. I can help you, if you wish. Arcady twitched the sheets back. Okay, he said. Those few steps back to the bed were the worst Ghost had ever taken. He felt the floorboards under his bare feet, coated with a dry and silken dust. Arcady's skin would feel that way against his own. Arcady's hands would caress his soul. Arcady's tongue would explore his brain. No, said a voice from the dark doorway. Ghost's eyes swept the darkness. Steve? Arcady hissed air in through his teeth. You. Get your hands off him, said Steve. He gripped either side of the door jamb, holding himself up. His hair stood up in crazy dark tufts and wings, shoved messily behind his ears, a weak dirty. Let him go, mother effer, he told Arcady again. I don't care what kind of bad butt juju guy you are. Right now I could reach down your throat and tear your foul black heart out with pleasure. Arcady let go of Steve. Come on, said Steve. He jerked a thumb toward the staircase. We're leaving. We're getting in the gosh darn T-Bird and going home. Anne can get torn apart from inside out if that's what has to happen, if that's what she wants. You're not gonna make yourself into a whore for her, or for me, or for anybody. You're too good for that, Ghost. You're too gosh darn fine. Wait, called Arcady when they were halfway down the hall. Indeed, you are too fine. We must band together against the eternal night. The vampires took my brother, and I will not let them take another beautiful young life. I will help you. Lord help me. I will help you. And Arcady Raventon crossed himself twice, first upside down, then right side up. Basil, said Arcady. Bay leaf. Steve shifted, slumped further. Crap, we could have gone to the A&P for this. Penny Royal, said Arcady, lowering his eyelids at Steve. Yarrow, brook lime, and garlic. A small secret smile crooked his lips. It won't like all this garlic. With a flourish, he uncorked a small blue bottle and poured a few drops of cloudy liquid into the mortar. Herbs hissed coldly. A twist of vapor wafted up. Ghost watched Arcady scrape the paste from the mortar onto a square of waxed paper. Arcady folded the square of paper in half and twisted the ends. That, he said, is that. Now you must find the girl and bring her to me. Steve and Ghost started speaking at once. How the F are we supposed to do that, said Steve. I can do that, said Ghost. Chapter 29. Ghost leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. There were a million sides to everything. Most people were able to block out some of them. Ghost sometimes thought he saw them all, not that it helped. Mary Sue, you are a Mary Sue. In the center of the open area, a girl lay supine on a low marble slab. Bunches of dried, long-stemmed roses were arranged around the slab, crimson gone to black, white to ivory, yellow and pink to dusty echoes of themselves. Then the girl raised her head, and Ghost saw what he had known all along. It was Anne, and she was sick. What's that? Asked Anne. She was staring wearily at the altar in the back room of Arcady's shop. The shop was dark and empty, but Arcady had left the door unlocked, and Steve stepped out from behind the door and plastered a wet cloth over her face. When she went limp in his arms, Steve's face slackened too. For a moment he looked as if he would collapse with her, but he held Anne upright and steadied her drooping head against his shoulder, then slid his other arm under her knees, cradling her. Ghost couldn't remember the last time he had seen Steve hold Anne so tenderly. Arcady clapped his hands. The sudden sharp sound brought all movement in the room to an end. Steve stopped pacing. Ghost shut his mouth without finishing his sentence. Even the dust seemed to stop sifting down. I know just the thing, said Arcady. I will care for the girl. I will watch over her. You'd only get in the way. There was no question which of them he meant, but for once Steve didn't snarl. I've told you about Ashley's friends, the ones in the other guest room. They are musicians, and they will be performing tonight at a club on Rue de Cator. The club serves the strongest drinks and all the vieux carré, and when you come back, everything will be over. The child will be dead, and you can take your aunt home again. As he turned to leave the room, he flapped his hand toward the foot of the bed. A tangle of cotton bandages trailed onto the floor. You'll want to wrap her up, Arcady told Steve. Tightly enough to keep some of the blood in, but loose enough to let out the matter. Steve winced. Arcady made his exit, white robes swirling behind him. He would not let himself part her legs to look. When Anne was wrapped from her waist to the middle of her thighs in white cotton, Steve pulled the sheet up to her chin. Steve sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, looking at her face. She didn't look any different. Tired, that was all. They might have just made love. I hate him. I hate him. I hate him. I hate. He kissed her through the bandages, right at the V where her thighs met. Then he stood up and walked toward the door, and only when he saw how blurred it was did he realize his eyes were overflowing. Steve, her mind shrieked, but he never turned around. When you go to the store for one thing and you come back with like 10 others, oh my God. I went for caffeine and I had to carry the tote bag home. My shoulder is bright red. Oh my God. Oh my God, I'm so sweaty. Chapter 30. Arcady lit a candle and started down the stairs. He would get a packet of dried leaves that needed grinding. He would sift them to dust between his fingers as he sat beside Anne's bed. He would keep vigil beside the girl all night, or at least until Steve and Ghost returned. He would mark her bleeding, watch her temperature, daub her forehead with ice. He would take good care of her. He only hoped his concoction would work. He had told Ghost he'd developed it after the death of Rochelle, and this was true, but he had neglected to mention that it had never been tested on anyone. The stairs were dark, but the two faces seemed lit by an unhealthy glow from within. Arcady could make out their sharp features, their drawn mouths, the tired gleam of their eyes through the cheap sunglasses they wore. "It's only you two," he said. "You gave me a turn." They started up the stairs toward him. "Look at us, Arcady," said one of them. His voice was only a rustle, like a voice sifting through dried moth wings. "We've waited too long," said the other, and his voice was like a wind that blew from far away over a stagnant sea. "We can't find anyone, we can't even look in the mirror, and we have a show to do." Arcady kept backing up the stairs. He heard his own breath sobbing in and out of his throat. "What do you want?" "It's time, Arcady," said the first one. He smiled, and patches of ivory skin flaked away from his cheeks, pattering the stairs, mingling with the dust. The other one smiled too. His lips were caked with dry rouge, once red, now faded to dusty orange. Even in this dim light, Arcady could see the delicate tracery of lines that webbed the twins' faces and disappeared beneath their sunglasses. "We need you," said the first one. "It's easy. You can join your brother." "There's a girl upstairs," Arcady heard himself say. "Young, pretty, you can have her." The first one shook his head in mock reproach. His ruby hair whipped his face. "No, Arcady, we don't want your pretty girl. Not yet, anyway. Next you'll be telling us to go find a whore on Bourbon Street. We're hungry. We know you. We need you. We love you," Arcady said the other, smiling even more wildly. The twins fed for 2 hours. They pressed themselves close against Arcady's body, and every crack and pore of their skin became a tiny mouth, a minuscule suck hole, questing deep into Arcady's tissue to extract every drop of moisture, of vitality, of whatever love might still be buried in Arcady's bitter heart. They tiptoed into Steve and Ghost's room and stood on either side of the bed. There was a strong smell of blood. They leaned over the bed and breathed in deep, going past the girl's odor of sweat, blood, and sorrow, trying to scent out the pulse of life still beating. Then they looked at each other and shook their heads. "Let's leave after the show tonight," the redhead murmured. "Let's blow this town." "Of course, then, anything you want. But why so suddenly?" The redhead glanced at the bloody hump on the bed. Then he tilted his head back and smiled into his brother's silver eyes. His grin was warm, lazy, insouciant. "Don't you see what happened to her?" he asked. "Where's the elegance in that? This is a trashy town. Too many darned bloodsuckers here." Out on the landing, Arcady's fingers still scraped uselessly at the floorboards. Flakes of parchment skin sifted from him with every feeble twitch. "Goodbye, Arcady, dear," said the redhead, unconcernedly. The twins picked up Ashley's skull at the bottom of the stairs and took it with them as they left. Chapter 31. I don't care. It's like all these goth kids in a goth bar. And then the music started. And they're so cool. They're so cool. Wow, they're so cool. Incredible. Amazing. Amazing. Wow, incredible. Death is easy. Blah, blah. Chapter's over. Chapter 32. Christian stood at the window. His back was rigid, his face drawn with disgust. At last, when the retching had subsided, he said, "Do none of you possess the sense of smell?" No one replied. "Do none of you possess the sense of taste?" Still no answer, because if his cancer was far enough along to make all of you this sick, Wallace Creech must have reeked like a fresh grave. Or were you so eager to make your kill in our alley under our window that you paid no attention to the very things that give you power? Are you all mad? Wild-eyed, Christian surveyed the room for a moment. Then, as if he knew the answer to his own question, he turned back to the window. "You're so smug," hissed Zilla from the corner. "But what happens when you drink our poisons? Give you a double shot of chartreuse and you'll be flat on your back, just like us." His eyes snapped green fire, visible from across the room. "Yeah," he whispered. "Yeah, you know what I think? I think if we have to be sick, then you should be sick too." Christian hesitated, wary. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe you should have a drink, Chrissy." Molokai giggled. "Have a drink, Chrissy." Twig took up the chant. "Have a drink, Chrissy, have a drink." "You can't make me," said Christian, but cold fear trickled down his spine. 24 hours puking our guts out, mused Zilla, then 24 more to recover. We could be on the road by the next night. The van's gassed up. Twig has the keys. Could he live like this? With Zilla always threatening him, dangling the constant specter of loneliness over his head? Christian considered the alternative. If they left, he would lose not only them, but nothing too. "Don't make me do this," he said when he had the bottle in his hand. He spoke calmly, but it was a plea born of desperation. Zilla only stared at him, eyes still flaring. His breath hissed in and out through his teeth, quick, jagged, painful. "Have a drink, Chrissy," he said. The first shot blazed green agony as it went down, and then Zilla made him drink another, and then another. Pathetic. Almost done, though. Whee! Chapter 33. Blah, 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 blah. God, this is a long chapter. Similar to chapter 20 is annoying to cover because everybody gets a point of view, but not much happens. Fortunately, it's not nearly as long as chapter 20. It's only like 40-some pages, but I'm still going to tell it this way because, frankly, like a lot of it is from Ghost's point of view and a little bit of Steve, and it's so much Steve and Ghost and Steve angst and only Steve angst, and the only angst that matters is Steve's, and it's annoying. So I'm just going to tell you what happens. Okay, so Anne's dead. Steve and Ghost leave the concert thingy they're at. They go back to Arcades. They see Anne, and everyone gets real angsty for a while. Anne's dead. What did we do? Did we cause this? Why did we trust this guy? Was she always going to die? I don't know. Yada yada, angst. And then Steve is like, "Okay, I'm gonna kill the vampires. Use your fancy boy brain powers to bring us over to where the vampires are so I can kill them." And Ghost is like, "Okay, sure, why not?" So they go over to where the vampires are. The vampires are all very sick, including Christian, who drank all that alcohol. So there's all four of them are just like throwing up constantly, blacking out, waking up to vomit some more, blacking out again. And as it was said, they've been doing this for like at least a day by now. Ghost and Steve leave Arcades. They find their way to Christian's apartment. Steve, the first vamp he sees in this room is Christian, and Steve just stabs him right in the heart. Christian's dead. Zilla wakes up. He has his own weapon. He cuts Steve with it. Steve is bleeding. Ghost panics. He takes the knife in Christian's chest, rips it out, and right in his noggin. Zilla got a knife in his head. Zilla's dead. Nothing is conscious. He's aware, but he's too sick to do anything. He's mostly just horrified that this is happening, and he has a lot of angst about it. His boyfriend, lover, father guy just was murdered, and also a Christian who he has kind of a thing with is also dead. Twig and Molokai are actively vomiting while this is happening. They can't do anything about it, so nothing takes control. He tells Ghost and Steve, yo, get out of here right now. I'm not going to hurt you, and I'm not going to let the other two hurt you, but you need to leave right now. And then Ghost and Steve just leave. And my commentary is thus: cowards. 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 I know that I personally have a soft spot for Nothing, and I don't particularly want him to die, but they're all evil vampires who murder people, and you stop at 2? There's 3 more. They're too sick to do anything about it. Just stab them. Come on. Why are you so ineffectual that even at the end of the story you can't kill the monsters? Steve, Ghost, come on. But no, they leave. Nothing's sad, but he's having his, one of his little, I've gotten a little bit more mature, ding, moments. And then it switches to the next day. Molokai and Twig are capable of, moving around and stuff again. And they're like, what the heck, man? Zilla would have killed them. And Nothing's like, yeah, well, I'm alpha man. And he has, I'm an alpha, and you can't cross me. I'm the leader here, looking at them kind of thing that he did earlier in the book. And the other two are like, yeah, okay, you're alpha. And that's literally it. They don't go after them. It ends with them, just eating their friends. They eat their friends. That's it. That's what happens. They eat them, and that's the end of that chapter. Yup. Chapter 34. Steve was quiet for a while. Everything that happened last fall, I know it was real. I mean, I was there, but it's still hard, Ghost. Steve spread his arms wide. What does it do to you? How do you deal with it? Doesn't it screw you up to know that we touched something evil, that it's still out there in the world? Steve was letting himself think about those days again. For a long time, he had refused to. His world was visibly torn apart, but he would not acknowledge what had sundered it. Ghost held him during his night terrors and never tried to make him talk. But a postcard had come in the mail last week, a brightly colored postcard, its edges ragged, its message blurred with the grime of small-town post offices. Ghost knew Steve had seen it. You are safe, the card had said. You will be safe as long as I live, forever, or nearly so. I love you. And the signature was scrawled large across the bottom, the T like a dagger thrusting down, the N in the loop of the G swooping like bat's wings. Nothing. I don't know, Ghost said at last. Maybe they were evil, like Miss Caitlin says. My grandmother told me you shouldn't try to define evil, that the minute you think you've got it all pinned down, a kind of evil you never even thought of will sneak up behind you and jump inside your head. I don't think anyone knows what evil is. I don't think anyone has the right to say. So maybe they were just like us. I hate what they did, what they do, but they'd hate our lives too. Maybe they did what they had to do to live and tried to get a little love and have a little fun before the darkness took them. I love you, Ghost. Ghost felt his heart expand. Love you too. Epilogue, 50 years later. Night. Black night in a club, 4 a.m., relieved only by the watery neon pulse that filters through the holes in the ceiling. These dives have changed very little. The walls are painted black, scorched in spots, crawling with arcane graffiti, spiky insignia, dripping band emblems sprayed in golden red. On the tiny stage, separated from the dance floor by strands of barbed wire, 2 members of a snuff rock band are packing up their equipment. The chords and effects, the violin bows and bone saws, the ampules of blood the audience thinks is fake. They mix it with alcohol to keep it from coagulating too quickly. They have not forgotten their old customs. The band have finished packing up. At the sound of their footsteps approaching, the young man comes awake, blinking up at them. At first his vision makes them hazy, and he thinks there are 3 of them. 3 clumps of hair, 3 faces defined in blots of dark makeup. But slowly they come clear, and there are only 2. He smiles up at them and asks, "What did you bring me?" Malachi pulls his hand out of his pocket and opens his fingers. Lying on his grubby palm is a hypodermic needle full of blood. "We saved the last for you," Twig tells him. "We can get more," says Nothing. The others nod in agreement. "We can always get more," says Nothing. A smile of happy anticipation spreads across Malachi's scarified face, and he jabs Twig in the ribs. Twig returns the jab with a tug on one of Malachi's tiny braids. "Because we have time," Nothing tells them, "forever and ever." For the first time in years, he thinks of Christian, his smooth and passive face, his coldly tragic eyes. He believes Christian would be proud of him now. Or nearly so, he whispers a beat later. But the others have already turned away. As they climb the stairs to street level, the sound of their boots on the cement echoes back along the graffiti-swarming corridor, up through the spiderwebs and the maze of burned-out girders, out into the night. Night, and they are gone, the footsteps still echoing, then silent, then black. Oh my god, that took forever. We did it, guys. We made it through that book. Confetti! Yay! Round of clapping! Woo! And now, my review. I'm largely neutral. It may not seem like it, but I am. My biggest gripe with this Lost Soul story is that the bare bones of the story, the skeleton of it, there isn't much to it, you know? Vampires meet some humans. A human gets knocked up. She dies. The humans kill the vampires. That's the end of the conflict. I think that it would have worked better for me if this novel had been made in two different ways. Either the story was pared down into a secondary short story, because the prologue was originally published as a short story, and then the rest of the novel was added later. If it had been like one short story and then a sequel, I think that could have worked really well. Or possibly like a novella, so like 100 pages or so instead of the 400 that we get. It's just too much. Or the other way is that, and I think this one is one that I like the most, is if it had been turned into a sort of anthology-esque book where each chapter is its own story and it's got the umbrella over the overarching plot. I also think it would have worked better because then they could have played with time more, because it felt like both a lot of things happened within a week and like nothing happened in a week. That's it. That's my biggest gripe. A lot of words, not much story. The horror's fine. I mean, I had a reaction to it. I'm sure you had a reaction to the stuff that was in here. You know, ick, gross, weird, I hate this. Those are all reactions. They're fine. I've read worse horror. I like the vampires. It's hard for me to be like, ew, I don't like these vampires, okay? So I'm probably always going to say I like the vampires, but I do. I like how they're seedy and disgusting, that their morals are different, that, you know, familial relationships occur and nobody cares. That's so gross and weird and intriguing. It's an intriguing world that Poppy has created, and I'm happy that I got to delve into it for a little while. However, I've delved into this particular book too many times in the last while, so I'm happy to put it down and not look at it again for a very long time. It's definitely not a fave. I don't necessarily hate it. This is my milk toast reaction. I'd love to hear what you think, either of this video or of the book itself. You know, if you love it, tell me why. That would be so interesting and fun to share opinions. And yeah, that's my review. Sorry if it's not dramatic enough. Thank you for getting this far in this freaking long ass video. Holy crap. I intend to make more, so, you know, subscribe or whatever, hit the bell. I like to do lives every Sunday. That's it. I made bracelets. This one says Anne. This one says nothing. This one says ghost. This one says Steve. And this one is from an art fair made by a kid. And it's a little hot dog. Again, you can't leave my book club, so be nice to me.